If I could describe the Cold War with a single word, it would be overlooked. Prior to the making of this video, the only thing I could tell you about the period was the Berlin Wall, the space race, communism, all in all the basics. But with the making of this video, I was able to learn about the secret operations of foreign spies, hidden proxy wars, weird weapons, and so much more, which has been compiled into an iceberg chart of 150 stories, where the more well-known ones are up top, but as we go further down, they become more obscure. Quick apology for this video being late, but I wanted it to be the best thing I've edited yet. And after over 2 months of work, I think it might be. Let me know if you think so, but more importantly, I hope you enjoy it. But you've waited long enough for this, so there's no sense in waiting any longer. Let's begin with Tier 1. Once the dust of World War II settled, the Allied powers began their reconstruction of Europe. And of course, one of the major works to be done was in Germany. The nation was split into 4 quadrants, each being controlled by an Allied power. The capital, Berlin, was located within the Soviet zone, but it was too split into 4 quadrants. This was the status quo for a while, but as political divisions increased between Russia and the other allies, Russia began to push the other allies out of Berlin. This would be a back-and-forth struggle for about a decade, but tensions rose with the space race, and people located in East Berlin fled to West Berlin with the Allied powers, and Russia didn't want this to happen. So a border wall entered construction in August of 1961. The official reason for the wall's construction was to keep the West Berliners out, as before this, people in East and West Berlin could travel freely, but with the wall's construction, not anymore. After 2 weeks of construction, 96 miles of concrete and barbed wire stretched across the city. This did not halt the flow of refugees, as people spent the next 20 years trying to get across into West Berlin, and over 5,000 Germans were a part of this. Eventually, the wall fell. As the Cold War calmed down in the 80s, East Berlin officials loosened up travel restrictions, and on November 9th, 1989, a spokesman for East Germany announced these policy changes, but accidentally said they were taking place immediately, causing an influx of West Berliners to go to the wall, to which they were let through. That weekend, over 2 million people came to either side of the wall, and began its demolition. And by October of 1990, it was gone, and Berlin was reunified. The Berlin Wall is probably the symbol of the Cold War, as the metaphorical divide taking place between the USSR and America was made a literal divide with a massive concrete wall cutting Europe in half, so expect it to pop up several times. Towards the end of World War II, Germany took an interest in getting things shot into space. This manifested itself with the V rocket program, but these were repurposed into making missiles for their war effort. Once World War II ended, both Russia and America recruited various scientists in the V program, but they weren't interested in warfare. They wanted them for their original purpose. The space race was on. Interest in space missions began in the 50s, and Russia had a head start with Sputnik, the first man-made object to be sent into space. This was launched on October 4th, 1957, and America would launch their own in 1958. Space was becoming a big deal to both of these countries, and the conversation was circling around landing a man on the moon. But, by all accounts, Russia was winning. They launched the first man into orbit while America was still testing chimps. They did eventually get their own man into orbit, John Glenn. This was done in 1962. But if we back up to 61, newly elected President John F. Kennedy made the following promise.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
This was a bold statement, and not a lot of Americans agreed with it. Nonetheless, the space race persevered. America wanted to win this race, so NASA's budget exploded. It was now employing over 400,000 people, from engineers to astronauts. Meanwhile, Russia was facing setbacks. In 1966, their chief engineer Sergei Korolev passed away, hindering their progress. Meanwhile, America was ramping up, and in December of 1968, Apollo 8 was launched. This was the first crewed space flight to orbit the moon. Then, just a little over a year later, Apollo 11 was launched. On July 16, 1969, Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins left Earth, and 4 days later, they landed on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So who won the space race? It's not a question, America did. Sure, the Soviets made the checkpoints first, but America crossed the finish line. The space race was, once again, a major part of the Cold War, so expected to see it plenty of times throughout. After returning home from war, Joseph McCarthy took an interest in politics, and decided to run for senator in the 1946 election, to which he won. At first, he remained relatively quiet and peaceful, before suddenly exploding at Wheeling, West Virginia, giving a speech claiming that 205 communists had joined the United States government, holding a list in his hands. With that, he just began the Red Scare. Thanks to McCarthy's words, everyone began to point fingers back and forth in an attempt to find the communists among them, and any little signs of dissent led to an investigation. For example, any association with the color red meant you were a communist. Purple is my favorite color. Anyways, at the onset of McCarthy's second term, he was put in charge of the Committee of Government Operations, which let him further these searches. And did he find anybody? Well, a few, but it was definitely overblown. In the last few years of his life, McCarthy was mostly ignored, as he had lost a lot of prominence in the Senate. He would pass away in 1957 at the age of 48. Throughout the Iceberg, we're going to discuss various aspects of pop culture and how they were affected by the Cold War. And we can begin with one of the biggest songs to come out in the time frame, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, which is written about both sides. The song was created by Tears for Fears and is by far their biggest hit. It was released with their second studio album, and it was actually a last-minute addition. The album was released in 1985, and it was really successful. But enough background, what's the song actually about? Well, the song was originally called Everybody Wants to Go to War, but was renamed. But that should give you an idea. It's about the Cold War, and it's a criticism of both sides of the war, condemning them for their greed and desire for power, albeit at the paranoia of their citizens, fearing a nuclear exchange. The song came out towards the end of the Cold War, as in just a few short years, the Berlin Wall would be torn down and the USSR would break up. This is just the first of a few songs we're going to talk about with the Cold War, and we'll cover more as we go further down the iceberg. Imagine this. You're a radio operator working during the Cold War. It's late at night, and you're scanning, trying to pick up on any signal you can, and you do end up finding something. This.
39715. 39715.
This isn't far off from what's happened, as these were a common way of passing coded information during the Cold War. These were number stations. These were used since World War I, but they really picked up prominence during the Cold War, and a lot of these number stations are still in operation to this day. Perhaps the most famous number station was Swedish Rhapsody, and if you're on the creepy side of YouTube, I'm sure you've heard it. Let's take a quick listen. Gathering intel on the Soviet Union was one of America's greatest goals, and there were several methods implemented. Of course, human spies were used, but of course, Russia had all eyes looking at anything suspicious. So America had to find an inconspicuous way to spy. This gave rise to the Acoustic Kitty program, an idea to kit out a cat with spy equipment, then let it loose in the USSR or any embassy to gather intel. In an hour-long process, a veterinarian would implement a microphone and radio into the cat's body, and somehow, this project racked up a $20 million bill. In the day's first mission, the cat was set loose outside the USSR embassy in Washington, where it was immediately struck and killed by a taxi. The program was soon cancelled after this. In the simplest terms possible, a proxy war is a war fought between two sides using a respective party, or a proxy. Basically, it's a way for world powers to get involved without directly getting involved. and there were several throughout the Cold War. This is why people say the Cold War never heated up. Sure, there were these proxy wars, but the USSR and USA never directly fought each other. In fact, that's why the Vietnam War can be considered a proxy war, since the Soviet Union and China acted through their proxy, Vietnam. Other proxy wars during the Cold War include the Angolan Civil War, the Congo Crisis, and a handful of independence movements. Among the rising concern of the Soviet Union, the United States, Canada, and several West European countries came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO was founded on April 4th, 1949, and is still active to this day. At its inception, it was made up of 12 members, which now consists of 32, with the most recent member being added being Sweden. One of the defining features of NATO is Article 5, which in layman's terms states that if a NATO member is attacked, all members are to respond. And this has only been invoked once, during the 9/11 attacks on America. In response to the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union formed their own boy band, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact had 8 nations in total at its formation, and these two sides never had military conflict. The only time the Warsaw Pact worked together was during an invasion of one of their own members, when they invaded Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. The Warsaw Pact began to break down in the late 80s, with the first member to leave being East Germany after German reunification in 1990. Then, on July 1st, 1991, the Warsaw Pact came to an end, with the USSR falling apart mere months later. Since the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, 14 members of the former have joined NATO. While the Cold War remained cold, there were several insanely close calls, and perhaps the closest one was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Post-World War II America had a deep interest or concern with Cuba. The new leader, Fidel Castro, was a communist, and the American government did not feel safe having a commie power so close to home, so several attempts at removal of Castro took place. Russia was not happy with this. They were allies with Cuba, and seeing these attempts on the nation was something Russia wanted stopped. So Khrushchev and Castro met in July of 1962, where it was agreed that Russia would install long-range nuclear missiles on the island nation. This was a problem. See, people weren't too concerned with a nuclear strike, as neither nation-state had the capability of launching a missile that far. But now, here one was 500 miles off the coast of Florida. However, America had their own missiles close to the Russian home as well, as they had installations installed in Turkey and Italy, so now both sides were in a bit of a panic. For 13 intense days, negotiations went back and forth, and it took a long time for these messages to go back and forth. It would take 6 hours for a message to go from Moscow to Washington, each way. So every time a message was sent, 12 hours would pass before a return was given. But the crisis was solved, and we didn't go to war. What was decided was that America would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy, and Russia's from Cuba. That following year, a direct hotline was installed between the two nations' capitals, easing communications should something like this happen again. It's 1948. Europe is still recovering from the horrors of World War II, and America is implementing plans previously made. And the biggest policy was about to be implemented, with the Marshall Plan. In total, $13 billion of aid was given to West Europe. The goal of America was to allow European entry into American markets while also rebuilding areas devastated by the war. So why is this on a Cold War iceberg? Well, it's because it started the Cold War. Joseph Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as an attempt to shut out communism, and he, along with other Eastern Bloc countries, began to condemn the actions of America. Meanwhile, the Western countries were loving it, and they began to associate more and more with the United States, marking the beginning of Europe's division. Like we said, America had problems with Cuba thanks to the communist state being so close, and they had several attempts at removal of the leader, Fidel Castro. Perhaps the biggest was the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was an attempt by the Kennedy administration to have a land invasion of the island, and it was a failure. On April 15, 1961, 8 bombers left the United States ally of Nicaragua, headed for Cuba. But due to the time difference between these two nations, the planes arrived late, causing the ground forces to go in without air support. Even before this, the attack was leaked to the press, and Kennedy said, "Castro doesn't need spies over here, he can just read our papers." Thanks to Castro's forewarning, he was able to move all critical supplies, such as his own planes, so they couldn't be destroyed from an aerial assault. That's basically it. And the Bay of Pigs serves as the lowest point of Kennedy's presidency. In the next entry, we're going to discuss MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, in its entirety, but we'll do a quick introduction. It was thought if one nuclear power would fire, then every nuclear power would fire, assuring the destruction of both worlds. This was, and I guess still is, the policy on nuclear war. But in the 80s, President Ronald Reagan was a strong opponent of this policy, as he felt America should have a way to defend itself against a nuclear strike. In a speech given in 1983, Reagan laid out the goals of having a total defense infrastructure against any form of missile attack on the United States. This program was named the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as it became known as, Star Wars. Yes, coming from the recently released movie. And the reason for the science fiction names comes from the fact he wanted a science fiction system. Part of Star Wars would have used lasers armed with nuclear warheads to shoot down incoming Soviet missiles. And so, the arms race bled in with the space race. This upset the Soviets, as they saw it as an egregious step in the Cold War, like America was preparing for a first strike from their own country, and they would have defense against a retaliatory strike. But there were domestic problems too. People were criticizing him for the vast amounts of money this project was about to cost, along with the amount of time it was going to take. Because of this, Star Wars was never implemented. On November 18, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev was giving a speech at the Polish embassy in Moscow. In his address to the capital states, he says the following:
"Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you."
Which was controversial to say the least. America and other Western forces were very outspoken against this speech, perceiving it as a threat of war. But there was a problem. This is not what Khrushchev said, or it's not what he intended. His words were misinterpreted. What he meant to say was that your working class is going to bury you, not us personally, meaning that our system was flawed and was going to collapse on its own. Khrushchev also said this quote was spread far and wide as possible to serve as propaganda, labeling his nation as warmongers, which was not his intent. I think it's only fitting to end Tier 1 of a Cold War iceberg with the death of the man who basically started the Cold War. As World War II came to its end, so did Joseph Stalin. His health was deteriorating pretty quickly, suffering a stroke and a heart attack in 1945. After years of decline, his end would come in February of 1953. After a night of partying, Stalin went to bed, and ordered his guards not to disturb him until he was awake. But Stalin would not wake up. His housekeeper went to his room the very next day to see him unconscious on the floor, suffering from another stroke. His condition deteriorated more over the next few days before he died on March 5, 1953. Across the continent, in Landsberg, West Germany, a young man working for the United States Army got a message in Morse code, and he translated it, revealing that Joseph Stalin was dead. That young man was Johnny Cash, the first American to know Joseph Stalin's death. At his funeral service the following day, so many Russians were eager to see their former leader that a stampede broke out, killing over 100 people in the chaos. So this brings Tier 1 to a close. Joseph Stalin is dead, but I'm sure we're going to see him pop up as we go further down. On June 19, 1953, United States officials marched a couple into a pair of electric chairs at the Sing Sing prison in New York. They were set down, and the lever was flipped, marking the first American citizens to be executed for espionage. But we have a long way to go before we get there. Let's back up. This is Ethel Greenglass, a clerk working at a shipping company. She was also a member of the Young Communist League, where she met her future husband, Julius Rosenberg. Julius was one of the leaders of the Young Communists, and he would soon graduate with a degree in electrical engineering, which got him a job as an engineer inspector working with the United States Army Signal Corps. It's here where he worked on important research involving guided missiles. But his previous connections with the Communist Party were discovered, so he was removed from his position. But the damage was done. He had provided thousands of classified reports to the USSR, everything from fuse diagrams to production drawings of fighter jets. Meanwhile, Ethel's brother was working on the Manhattan Project, the United States atomic program, so information for that was fed to Ethel. The Rosebergs' connection to the USSR was Harry Gold, who served as their middleman. Through various arrests made post-World War II, Julius's espionage was uncovered, and he was arrested on suspicion of espionage on July 17, 1950. Ethel would be arrested a month later. In a very surprise decision, likely fueled by the Red Scare and the Cold War as a whole, the Rosebergs were sentenced to death. The two pled their cases for 2 years, but both Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, the presidents at the time, dismissed the case. So now we're back to where we started. The Rosebergs were put into the electric chair, where they were executed. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, the United States has reported a total of 6 missing nuclear warheads. When one of these bombs goes missing, it's labeled as a broken arrow. There have been 32 broken arrows, but this does not always mean they're missing. For an arrow to break, it can unexpectedly blow up, leak, causing radioactive contamination, or just be lost, whether with or without its transport vehicle. Like we said, the United States is missing 6 nuclear weapons, and we'll discuss their stories throughout. Just know when we say broken arrow, we're talking about a nuclear weapon going missing. As the Korean War came to a close, the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, began a condemnation of the Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean usage of mind control against their American soldiers. But this was only a faux condemnation. It was more of an expression of jealousy that they had not begun their own mind control, because 3 days after this speech, the MK Ultra program began. One of MK Ultra's goals was a so-called truth serum, which basically would compel someone to tell the truth. But this was only one leg of the program. It basically centered around weaponized drug use, and even spearheaded attempts at drugging Fidel Castro. MK Ultra took place throughout several prisons, hospitals, and even universities, and was setting out to drugging unwilling and unknowing participants. The most commonly used drug was LSD, placing it in the drinking water and aerosols. At the onset of the Watergate scandal, the new CIA director ordered all files related to MK Ultra to be destroyed. But the first details of the program would come out in 1975, but the biggest release was 2 years later in 1977, when 20,000 documents relating to MK Ultra were declassified. This came from President Gerald Ford, who was setting up the place reforms within the CIA. MK Ultra is the story people point to when they're asked why they don't trust the government, and who can blame them. If they openly admitted to drugging their own citizens, what are they doing that's being hidden? Like we've mentioned, America had an interest in Cuba through the 1950s and 60s, as they were a newly blossoming communist country off the coast of Florida. A lot of this interest was funneled into Fidel Castro. Castro took power in the country with the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, 1959. The first attempt at his removal was the Bay of Pigs invasion, and there should be a heavy emphasis on first, as Fidel Castro holds the record for the most assassination attempts at over 600. And some of these things get weird. We'll cover a few. First of all, Fidel liked to collect seashells, and he would go to the beaches of Cuba to collect them. The CIA knew this, so they painted a seashell in bright colors, making it stand out, hoping Fidel would pick it up, not knowing an explosive was attached. Another attempt involved infecting his diving suit with tuberculosis, hoping he would get sick over time. Boxes of exploding cigars, pins of incredibly thin needles laced with poison, and multiple direct poisonings were all attempted. Then, the CIA tried to hire one of Castro's ex-lovers, Marita Lorenz, to go to Castro seeking affection and poisoning his drink while he wasn't paying attention. Castro found this plan out and pulled his .45 out, handing it to Lorenz saying, "You can't kill me, nobody can kill me." And Lorenz ended her mission that night by sleeping with her target. Other attempts at Castro's removal were considered that didn't necessarily count as assassinations. And the biggest example is putting LSD into his room's vents. That way, when he would give a speech, he would sound unhinged, losing him support. Despite all of these attempts, Fidel persevered, actually passing away peacefully in 2016. After the United States demonstrated the power of the atom on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union decided they wanted a piece of that power. Just 4 years later, the Soviet Union had their first atomic weapon. But now that they had a taste of that power, they wanted it all. So their nuclear weapons program ramped up, making bigger and better weapons, until they had the biggest then, and even today. Product 602 entered construction in 1960, the latest in a series of massive nuclear bombs. The finished bomb weighed nearly 60,000 pounds and was an impressive 6 feet in diameter. It would be dropped from a plane with a parachute weighing an additional 1,200 pounds, lowering it to the ground. And it was lowered on October 30th, 1961. The resulting mushroom cloud was over 30 miles tall, and it stretched out over 59. It was even taller than Mount Everest. The blast remains, to this day, the most powerful man-made explosion. The bomb was over 1,500 times more powerful than the atomic blast over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Buildings 100 miles away from the blast site were knocked over, and the shockwave was felt for 400 miles, with windows at 500 miles shattering. The ball was powerful and arrogant, like Jupiter. Slowly and silently it crept upwards. Having broken through the thick layer of clouds, it kept growing. It seemed to suck the whole Earth into it. The spectacle was fantastic, unreal, supernatural, a witness to the bomb said. A test like this couldn't be hidden, and Nikita Khrushchev didn't want to hide it. The world was shocked, and they immediately condemned the Soviet Union for the weapon they had just made. The bomb later would be named Tsar Bomba, or the King of Bombs. It was never meant to be a real product, just a test and a show of force to the rest of the world. In a major step in the space race, Laika became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. The common trope of animals in space are monkeys, but Laika was actually a dog. There are some common misconceptions about Laika, so let's debunk a few to begin. She was not the first animal in space, as that honor belongs to some fruit flies the United States had launched into orbit in 1947. And she was not the first dog in space, as Russia had launched 2 dogs before her. Laika was the first animal to orbit the Earth. Laika lived in the streets, and her name is Russian for barker because of how much she barked. The Soviet Union began training several dogs for a space flight mission, and Laika was the best well-behaved, so she was chosen. Unfortunately, this was a one-way flight, as there were no plans of bringing Laika back to Earth. She orbited the Earth 4 times and passed away 2 days into the flight. Today, Laika has a statue and a plaque at Star City, where the Russian cosmonauts were trained. Operation Paperclip was a program implemented by the United States at the end of the war, World War II. The goal was to recruit German engineers, scientists, and technicians for new positions in the United States. 1,600 personnel, along with their families, were brought into the States. One of the best well-known recruits was Wernher von Braun, the developer of the V-2 rocket. Because of this, he was given a job at NASA as a chief architect on the Saturn V, which is the first rocket to land on the moon with people aboard. During the space race, NASA used part of their ever-increasing budget to develop a pen that could write in space. The special model uses pressurized ink cartridges, meaning it could write in zero-gravity conditions and even underwater. The budget on this thing is rumored to be over $20 million. And if you ever see this, it's usually attached with that snarky, the Russians used a pencil. Well, NASA also used pencils at first, but because of the graphite dust getting in the astronaut systems, along with the flammable nature of the pencil's wood, NASA began development of these pens, which had a cost of $1 million in development, which was privately funded, not government funded. And get this, once the pen was developed, Russia bought them off of NASA to use in their own mission, recognizing the threat of using pencils. Once again, we can be thankful that the Cold War never heated up, because if it heated up, it was really going to heat up. Or at least, this is what both world powers thought. Both sides were wary of war, and more specifically, the destruction brought on by nuclear war. Both sides lived by the concept of mutually assured destruction. It was thought that if someone was going to fire a nuke, then someone else was going to fire a nuke, and then maybe someone's ally would fire one, and so on and so forth before we end up living in vaults. But MAD as a concept dates back way earlier than this, back to 1870. During the Franco-Prussian War, an English author named Wilkie Collins referred to MAD without using the actual term. I begin to believe in only one civilian influence, the discovery one of these days of a destructive agent so terrible that war shall mean annihilation and men's fears will force them to keep the peace. So it's interesting to look back and realize people saw the potential of technology being developed that would be so powerful it could end all of us. But of course, MAD mostly applies to the Cold War. The USA launched the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and 4 years later, the Soviet Union had their own nuclear weapon. But neither side had the capability of using the bomb on each other. By the time the Cuban Missile Crisis came along in 1962, both sides did have the capability of a launch. And with the crisis came the mention of MAD. Robert McNamara was the champion behind this, stating that if the United States would point nuclear weapons at all the Soviet population centers, it would scare them into not using their own nuclear weapons, therefore preventing a war, because if the Soviets fired, America would too. Then everyone loses.
Dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
And you,
and you and you.
duck and cover.
While the concept of mutually assured destruction was keeping nuclear warfare at bay, this fear was still constantly on the minds of American citizens. To combat this fear, President Harry Truman established the Federal Civil Defense Administration on December 1st, 1950. The point of the FCDA was to instruct American citizens on what to do should nuclear war come to the country, and they needed a way to convey this safety information to children. This gave rise to Duck and Cover, a 10-minute cartoon made to teach children how to remain safe in the event of a nuclear detonation. And this is where the infamous piece of advice of hiding under a desk came from. The film was screened with cartoons in the 50s and is now in the public domain. It's also in our modern times where the cartoon has been criticized the most. People see Duck and Cover as more of an anti-communism film, since the advice offered was less than stellar, downright useless. I'm sorry to say it, but a desk isn't protecting you from a nuclear detonation. It's theorized this was made more to scare children, making them fearful and distrustful of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan is often given the credit for tearing down the Berlin Wall when he gave his speech, but this was given on June 12, 1987, and the wall came down in November of 1989, a year later. So yes, this was an important factor in getting the wall tore down. We should also thank some other people, most notably the late, great David Bowie. A mere 6 days before Reagan's speech, David Bowie was performing in West Berlin, practically at the Berlin Wall. He began to perform Heroes, one of his most popular songs. Did you know Heroes is actually about the Cold War? It's a song about two lovers, one in East Germany and the other in West, being separated by the wall. Think of some of the lines. More specifically, I can remember standing by the wall. That's the literal Berlin Wall. Anyways, this song became an anthem in West Berlin, and as it played into the east, a massive crowd gathered at the east side to listen, where a massive riot broke out. The East Berliners chanted "The wall must fall," and all of this was televised, broadcasting this image to the world, sinking the wall's popularity even further. Thanks to this, Reagan's message, the Cold War ending, and the USSR falling apart, the Berlin Wall will be torn down a year later. Do you prefer Coke or Pepsi? Me? I don't drink pop, but if I do, I'll have a Dr. Pepper. I think both Coke and Pepsi are disgusting, but I'm in the minority, especially if I lived in the 80s. Everyone loved Pepsi, and the Soviet Union was craving it big time. We'll discuss later how a Soviet admiral smuggled it into the country before this story, but this deals with the pop being sold to the masses. Since the Soviet Union was lacking American currency on part of it being, the Cold War, and Soviet rubles were worthless outside the USSR, the country began to barter for imports, giving more material items and not cash. Previously, they were trading vodka for Pepsi syrup, which they would then mix with their own carbonated water, making Pepsi. This lasted up until 1987, but with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the American government imposed sanctions on all Soviet products, meaning PepsiCo could no longer sell the Russian vodka to the American market. On top of this, the deal between Pepsi and the Soviets was about to expire, meaning altogether, it was time for a new negotiation. The CEO of Pepsi, Donald Kendall, had flown to Moscow to meet with the Soviet officials, where they made a new deal. It was decided that $3 billion of Pepsi syrup would be sold to Russia, but then the same problem from earlier arose. Russia did not have a hard currency to trade. Instead, they offered something else. 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. So this made the Pepsi-Cola Corporation the 6th largest naval power at the time. But they had no intention of holding onto this hardware. They sold it to a Norwegian company, as they wanted it for scrap metal. As Vietnam declared independence, intending to set up a new communist government, alarms blared at Washington, D.C. They were firmly against communism and they wanted to hold it spread. It was worried that if this new communist government was set up and thrived, the rest of South Asia would follow, becoming their own communist countries. Dwight Eisenhower said the following:
You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is a certainty that it will go over very quickly.
Eisenhower had just discussed domino theory, and is part of the reason why we went to war in Vietnam, and why we fought so hard to halt communism at its roots, through invasions, assassinations, infiltrations, and whatever else we did and will never know about, because when one domino is tipped, the rest follow.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
This was a speech given by President John F. Kennedy on June 26, 1963, at the Berlin Wall. The speech was aimed at both West Germany and the Soviet Union, advocating for a free Berlin and a free Germany. And he included the famous quote, Ich bin ein Berliner. German audience, I am so sorry because I probably said that entirely wrong. But there is a common joke that Kennedy also said it wrong, as people believed he accidentally said, I am a jelly donut, as the Berliner was a type of dessert in the country. But Kennedy was correct in his pronunciation. In 1983, German band Nena released their biggest song in 99 Luftballons, and the song spells out a Cold War gone hot. The concept of the song comes from when the band's guitarist, Carlos Kargis, was attending a Rolling Stones concert in West Berlin. At the end of the show, a bunch of balloons were released, and Carlos watched the mass shift and change shapes as it drifted into East Berlin. And it made him think, what if that massive balloons was picked up by a radar, and it's thought it's a military craft? So East scrambles fighter jets into the West, and now there's a big mess. And this is exactly what the song is about. The song was a hit. Not just in Europe, it exploded everywhere, and had a very accidental success in America. A random DJ heard the song and began to play it in America, causing it to become popular. Nena saw its popularity in the States, and they released a version of the song in English, but it never topped the original German recording. Nonetheless, the song remained popular in any form throughout the rest of the Cold War, vocalizing the concerns of all citizens within the borders of these nuclear powers. Douglas MacArthur was one of the top generals in World War II, giving him a lot of prominence in the United States. But now as we stretch into the Cold and Korean Wars, President Harry Truman personally selected Douglas to lead these soldiers in South Korea. He assured the president it would be over by Christmas, and he had some wild ideas to accomplish his goal. Perhaps the most infamous one is the Sea of Irradiated Cobalt, where MacArthur wanted to drop 30 to 50 atomic bombs in China to slow the halt of support to North Korea. Truman was kind of flabbergasted, as he wanted a peaceful end to the war, and he actually had a ceasefire negotiation lined up, to which MacArthur ruined it by ordering his soldiers to invade North Korea, pushing past the 38th parallel, the line that separated the two Koreas. In response, Truman fired MacArthur. a decision that was controversial in the States, and it even sunk his approval rating to 22%. MacArthur, on the other hand, was more popular than ever, and actually considered running for president in the 1952 election, but his popularity waned, and the superior general, Dwight Eisenhower, won the presidency. Through the Cold War, the CIA was hard at work developing different technologies for their spies, and this is the first one to mention, the heart attack gun. It would shoot a small poison dart into a target's chest, and was small enough to make the victim think they were just bitten by a bug or something. This dart would also dissolve once in the chest, so during autopsy, they're just gonna think it was a heart attack. But that dart was full of a lethal poison that too dissolves quickly, making identification during an autopsy impossible. The existence of the heart attack gun was revealed in 1975 during a testimony given to Congress on the rogue activities of the CIA. In 1952, a Canadian reactor began to melt down, and the facility's basement was soon flooded with radioactive water. A crew was immediately gathered to fix the reactor, and they were lowered into the site for 90 seconds apiece, where repairs began. One of these men was President Jimmy Carter. Carter was a part of the United States Navy, and was a part of the crew on the first ever nuclear submarine, so he had experience working with the technology. The reactor was fixed, but the crew, including Carter, had some side effects. The most notable one was their urine. They had radioactive pee for 6 months after the incident, but no one died, especially no Canadians, thanks to the actions of Carter and his crew. I know we're only at tier 3, but get ready, because this is probably the craziest, weirdest, and most mysterious thing we will talk about on this iceberg. Operation High Jump. Officially, Operation High Jump was to be an expedition to Antarctica, to map the place out and to train American personnel in frigid conditions. The operation was announced in 1946 and was set to launch in December. The operation involved 13 ships, more than 4,700 personnel, and a variety of aircraft. The mission was led by Richard Byrd and was meant to be a survey mission, but people think High Jump had ulterior motives. Many think Operation High Jump was a mission to destroy a secret German base hidden on the frozen continent. The main conspiracy comes from the lost journal of Richard E. Byrd, and the journal is so lost I can't even find it. But sources say, as this unit pulled up to Antarctica, they were engaged by enemy aircraft. After this, the team apparently landed and were taken to a German underground base. Richard Byrd was allowed to leave, and after this, his journal was seized, and he was ordered to not talk about anything he saw. Roughly 8 years after this, the United States launched Operation Argus, which were secret tests to use the atomic bomb at Antarctica, and people believe this was done to destroy the underground base. Now, 3 years after this, the Antarctica Treaty was signed, forbidding private individuals from going to the island. Now, I probably got some of this wrong, and it was by far the hardest thing on this iceberg to research. I could hardly find anything on Operation High Jump because it's being hidden, or there's just simply nothing to find. I encourage you all to do your own research on Operation High Jump, but be warned, it's a rabbit hole. The closest we ever came to World War III was probably the Cuban Missile Crisis we discussed earlier. For 13 long, agonizing, intense days, the United States was ready to go to war, and ready to respond to one. Everyone was on high alert, as was the Soviet Union. So when an intruder alarm at the Duluth Sector Directional Center in Minnesota blared, the American government believed it was go time. Pilots at Volk Field Air National Guard Base in Wisconsin began to scramble fighters to respond, but as soon as the alarm was sounded, it was turned off. There was an intruder at the Duluth Sector Center, but it wasn't a Russian, it was only their symbol. A black bear had wandered onto the perimeter of the base. But the fighter jets in Wisconsin did not know about this. Their jets were armed with nuclear weapons and were about to take off for the Soviet Union. It took a base commander to drive a truck through the path of the jets to stop them from taking off. This was not the only close call. We had 13 days worth of close calls, and we'll discuss more as we go further down the iceberg. Let's discuss a false flag. Imagine this. You want to go to war with your neighbor, but your government isn't going to allow this war without cause. And your neighbor's pretty chill. But now let's say you go out, slash your car's tires, cut down a tree so it lands on your house, and you blame your neighbor and claim they're the ones who did this. Well, congratulations, you just created a false flag. False flags have been used all throughout history, and this goes double for the United States. During the Cold War, the Americans tried to perpetrate atrocities against their populace, claiming it was the Cuban government doing it, justifying an invasion of the island. The plans included the shoot-down of an American jet near the Cuban island, the killing of Cuban immigrants in America, the hijacking of American passenger planes, the sinking of boats coming from Cuba, basically damaging any ties we had to the island nation. These plans were rejected by John F. Kennedy, and this has given rise to the conspiracy that in response, the CIA began to consider the removal of the president. During the 1964 presidential election, Lyndon Johnson pulled a move that would fundamentally change how politicians advertise themselves from now on, scaring their voters. Lyndon and his team released the Daisy Girl ad, which features a young girl picking flowers before being obliterated by a nuclear weapon. Let's take a look.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live.
This ad was only aired once, but that's all that was needed. Previously, Barry Goldwater, who was running against Johnson, refused to sign the Nuclear Treaty Act, which would have banned the use of nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War. This ad was made in a direct response to Goldwater's refusal to sign, preying on the public's fear of a nuclear war. Like we said, this ad was only aired once, on September 7th, 1964, during a showing of David and Bathsheba, which was a family show. And this was done on purpose, as Lyndon Johnson's team thought it would have the most impact on the most amount of people. And did it work? Well, let's look at the electoral map. For 20 years, the code to launch 50 United States warheads was so simple a child could have guessed it. It was 8 zeros. Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense for JFK, and he oversaw the installation of the PAL device on missile arrays. This is basically the brain of this thing, and it's where a code is stored. And once McNamara left, the code was set to 8 zeros, and it was like this for 20 years. It should be noted, the code is far from the only thing you need, and the actual process of arming warheads was a lot more complicated than 8 zeros. On May of 1961, two Italian brothers were listening in with their radio when they picked up this audio, and they believe this was the sound of a Russian cosmonaut burning alive on re-entry, adding fuel to the fire of a conspiracy theory. Russia was launching astronauts with no regards to getting them back to Earth. This theory was spearheaded by the Italian brothers, Archil and Giovanni Battista. They had a very bootleg setup, operating out of an abandoned German bunker using scrap metal they had assembled to build a radio. But this is not the only recording they claim to have picked up. This is just the longest and most infamous. This recording predates Yuri Gagarin's famous flight, and he of course was the first man in space. But did Russia send other cosmonauts to their doom? Well, likely not. People claim that these voices in the recording break the way Soviet Air Force pilots were supposed to talk. But this isn't good enough evidence, as people can panic and break protocol. And if you're about to be burned alive, you're gonna panic, and the last thing on your mind is gonna be speaking protocols. Also, once the Soviet Union fell, there was a mass declassification of everything they had, and there were no records of these missing cosmonauts. But would they record that? Paper can be shredded, burnt, covered up, whatever else. All we're left with is the recording and a lot of questions. Even though World War II had came to an end, it did not mean international crises were coming to an end, and this was made evident by this entire iceberg, and made evident by the first major international crisis post-World War II. We're in Berlin, capital of Germany, that is now split up between the East and the West, with the Soviets in the West who continue to push the Allies out more and more each day. As we've mentioned, Germany is split in 4 quads, and Berlin was in the Russian quad, but it was too split. After discussions, it was decided that German reunification should be a priority, but Russia didn't want this. So, they blocked off their quadrant of Berlin off from the rest of Germany. This was a subtle effort at first, but in June of 1948, Russia had suddenly cut off all roadways and bridges in West Berlin. Russia was hoping to turn the citizens of East Berlin against the Eastern countries, and this was meant to be a show of force to these Western countries, causing them to leave Germany, but they did not. Harry Truman announced they weren't leaving, and it was decided they would supply their quadrants of Berlin from the sky with the Berlin airlift. Over 250,000 British and American flights flew over Berlin, and were dropping over 3,000 tons of supplies across the city, and the highest day peaked at 12,000. The Soviets believed this plot was going to fail, but upon seeing its popularity in East Berlin, they lifted the blockade. But the Allies continued to drop supplies for a few weeks after. In total, over 15 months, over 2.3 million tons of food, water, and fuel were dropped on East Berlin, averaging 5,100 tons per day. As the Berlin Wall entered construction, soldiers sent to patrol its build began to consider defection, and one soldier in particular helped kickstart this conversation. Konrad Schumann was sent to patrol the Berlin Wall on its third day of construction, and he began to notice the hostilities taking place right in front of his face. The citizens in the West hurled obscenities at him, and the scene in particular that stuck with him was this: a little girl passing flowers through the barbed wire to her mother. The young girl apologized for not visiting, and she pointed at Konrad saying, "Men like this won't let me visit." That hit Konrad hard. He then fully realized what was going on. He was a prisoner, in a country of prisoners, and he didn't want that. Later in the day, a riot began on the west side, and he took his chance. He ran, and he jumped through the barbed wire. His escape was photographed, and it was spread far and wide. Konrad began his new life in West Germany, living in peace. He started a family, got a job at a factory before passing away in 1998. On March 12, 1947, Harry Truman pledged his support to any and all democracies facing threats of authoritarianism. Without directly saying it, Truman confirmed the states would support anyone who felt threatened by Russia, and so he did, with the biggest support going to Turkey and Greece, as they were facing threats from Russia, or communism as a whole. It's not known exactly when the Cold War started, and historians point to different dates, and the issuing of the Truman Doctrine is one such date pointed to, thanks to it being an indirect stab at Russia. On August 11th, 1984, Ronald Reagan was delivering his weekly radio address just like he had done for months before. So why is this specific instance on the Iceberg? Well, because Reagan was making a joke of his speech, not realizing he was live on air. Alright, he made a joke, big deal. It couldn't be that bad, right?
My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan said this live on air. This stayed under wraps for a while, but leaked in August of the same year. This was criticized in the Soviet Union, and Reagan took a hit in the polls, much to Walter Mondale's delights. He now thought he had a better chance of winning. Overall, it was forgotten about. Soviet soldiers were not issued toilet paper while out on the field, so they had to make do with whatever they could get. This led to Soviet soldiers using official documents to wipe with, and French, British, and American spies began retrieving these documents for inspection. One area targeted was hospitals, and spies were complaining about having to dig through medical waste to get these documents, and they encountered a lot of amputated limbs. When these problems were brought to officials, they were instructed to bring the limbs with them, as it would give insight to the damage posed by Soviet weapons. This was Operation Tamarisk, and it's described as one of the most successful espionage missions conducted through the entire Cold War. When we discuss the paranoia attached to the Cold War, it's mostly centered around the United States' own fear, but the entire globe was blanketed in paranoia, and we can now discuss a story out of Europe. It's the 1980s, and things are heating up in Albania. The nation is being led by Enver Hoxha, who just took a stand against the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact had just invaded one of their own member states, Czechoslovakia. and Hoxha withdrew his support of the group, pulling his country from the pact in 1968. This was just another problem thrown on top of Albania, as they were in a back-and-forth war with some of their own neighbors. They had been fighting Greece since the end of World War II, and was hostile towards Yugoslavia and their leader, Joseph Tito. With all cut ties bordering Albania, fears of an invasion were at their height, so the Albanian government acted. Over the next 20 years, over 170,000 concrete bunkers were built in the country. From shorelines to the capital city, these things were everywhere. From as small as two-person houses to massive underground systems connected with tunnels. Enver Hoxha was sure an invasion was coming, and he wanted his populace to be safe. But the invasion never came. The bunkers briefly served their original purpose with the Albanian insurrection in 1997 and the Kosovo War of 1999, as civilians hid away in these bunkers during both conflicts. But for the most part, they went unused. These bunkers were a massive strain on the already struggling Albanian economy. Social works like roads and homes were being ignored in favor for the bunkers, but their construction had a more devastating effect. Roughly 75 people a year were dying during the construction of these things, and they were taking up a lot of space. Space that could have been used for farming or the previously mentioned social developments. Because of this, these things were, and still are, controversial to the Albanian populace. During their construction, they were criticized for their lack of purpose, as civilians wondered how long could people even hold out in these things before needing a resupply, and asking how communication between other bunkers would work. The bunker's construction ended in 1985 when Enver Hoxha passed away, but the damage was done. The entire country was dotted with these things, and a lot of them still stand to this day. However, the Albanian populace isn't waiting for an invasion. The bunkers have been repurposed into whatever a civilian needs. Restaurants, barns, secret hideaways, hotels, whatever you can think of, they're being used for. Also, the bunkers are a highlight to tourists. If you go to Albania, you're going to see one. There's also several souvenirs made to resemble the bunkers, everything from ashtrays to pencil holders. Reagan and Gorbachev, the two enemies of the 80s, Mr. Communist and Mr. Capitalist themselves. The two hated each other, but they did agree to put their differences aside for one and only one reason: an alien invasion. In a 2009 interview, Gorbachev revealed that him and Reagan were on a walk together, and out of nowhere, Reagan asked him if aliens were to invade the United States, would the Soviet Union help? To which Gorbachev said yes, they would, and Reagan told him yes, we would too. This was right in the middle of the Cold War, and both sides felt they needed to clear this up. On September 26, 1983, alarms blared at a Soviet Union Air Force base as 5 missiles were picked up, headed right for the Soviet nation. Now, Officer Stanislav Petrov had 2 options: return fire, surely ending the world in a nuclear holocaust, or wait and see if these things were really about to hit. Petrov went for the latter, and it was a great choice, as there were no missiles coming. It was a false alarm, caused by the sun refracting off the clouds. Petrov also rationalized his decision, believing if the United States were to launch nukes at the Soviet Union, they were going to send a lot more than 5. With the onset of the space race, there were 2 major obvious powers vying for control of the stars: the USSR and America. But just because these were the 2 big powers, doesn't mean others weren't trying. Now, most of Europe was still recovering from World War II. The last thing in their minds was space flight. But the other powers in the space race were not a European country. They were in Africa, the great nation of Zambia. The Zambian space program was championed by one man, Edward Makuka Nikolso. Nikolso was a science teacher, and was always obsessed with flying, falling in love with the practice when he flew in a plane as a child. This love and passion was reignited when the space race began, and he wanted his country to participate. But the Soviets and Americans were looking at the moon. While Edward dreamed bigger, he dreamed of Mars. He wrote to several nations, including America, the Soviets, and Israel, asking for $2 billion in funding, but he never got a cent. Nonetheless, he persisted, recruiting 12 astronauts. he put them through rigorous training, which included putting them in oil drums and rolling them down hills or spinning them around trees to prepare for weightlessness. Unfortunately, the Zambian space program fell apart and a launch was never attempted. I'm a big fan of the Fallout franchise, and if you're not familiar for some reason, it's a set of games where the Cold War never ends. The United States and China, not Russia, continue the Cold War, and the war in fact does heat up, and it's destroyed in a nuclear Armageddon. A lot of Fallout's inspiration comes from the 50s and the Cold War as a whole, and this includes one of the most iconic weapons, the Fat Man. The Fat Man is a shoulder-mounted catapult that launches miniature warheads, a pretty cartoony gun that fits right in with the world of Fallout. But did you know the Fat Man was based off a real weapon? Behold, the Davy Crockett. This was a weapon designed by the Americans during the Cold War, in which this thing was to launch a tiny nuclear device, a W-54 warhead that had a payload equivalent of 20 tons of TNT. However, the Davy Crockett never saw service, as it was simply too inaccurate, which doesn't make sense to me. Do you really need pinpoint accuracy for a nuclear warhead? Regardless, the Crockett was scrapped, but you can shoot the Fat Man as many times as you want in the Fallout games. As the Axis powers controlled Yugoslavia, a young man named Joseph Broz Tito began to organize a resistance movement consisting of the nation's laborers. Eventually, the Red Army of the Soviets got in on the action, and by the end of 1944, the nation was firmly in control of the communists, and Tito was calling the shots. Tito was a lifelong communist, and was even a part of the October Revolution that originally put Vladimir Lenin in control. Now in control himself, he restructured Yugoslavia into 6 combined nations, renamed the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. However, there was trouble in paradise. Many leaders were flocking to Joseph Stalin, except for Tito, and Stalin realized he wasn't going to be calling the shots there, and he wanted Tito out, and one of his puppets in. Beginning in 1949, Stalin sent several assassins to Yugoslavia, and one by one, they were stopped, and Tito had enough of this. In a letter addressed to Stalin, he said, "Stop sending assassins to kill me. We've already captured 5. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't need a second." Joseph did indeed stop sending assassins. As World War II came to a close, both the United Kingdom and United States realized they were going to have a problem with Russia. And it may surprise you to find out, but it was actually the United Kingdom who first began plans of war. And this plan was made before World War II was even over. And it called for a joint British, American, Polish, and reformed German soldiered invasion of the Soviet Union on July 1st, 1945. However, the Americans were still at war in the Pacific with Japan, so they couldn't fully contribute to this invasion. Plus, the Soviets had the numbers by far. It's thanks to this that Operation Unthinkable was cancelled. But if it went through, we wouldn't even be talking about this video. It would have ended the Cold War before it even started. If I had a nickel for every time a soda was smuggled into the Soviet Union during the Cold War, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it is strange it happened twice. And now we can discuss the second time it was done. At the end of World War II, a Russian general named Georgy Zhukov was working very closely with Dwight Eisenhower, and the two became close friends. Once their work was done, the 2 roommates did a tour of Europe, where Eisenhower introduced Zhukov to Coca-Cola. Now, being a Russian in the Cold War, Zhukov was scared to drink the pop, but he did drink it and he loved it. He asked if the beverage could be made colorless so he could drink it in the Soviet Union without fear of being labeled an American. Coca-Cola obliged, and an initial 50 cases of white-colored Coke were sent to the Soviet Union. The bottle was also made into a clear, straight glass bottle with a star on the cap, making it resemble a bottle of vodka. It's funny, because products entering the Soviet Union had a big, long process that took 3 weeks to get inside the country. But White Coke, that was passed right along and right into the hands of Georgy Zhukov. In October of 1983, Frank Meeks noticed one of his Domino's franchise was getting swamped with orders, and later that night, he read the news that the United States had just invaded the nation of Grenada. Again, in 1989, Meeks noticed a sudden increase in sales, and the following night, he read the news that America had invaded Panama. Meeks began to put 2 and 2 together, and decided that if there's a sudden increase in orders from his restaurant, America just made a major political decision, as employees at DC complexes were up working late, and they would need food to keep them going. and the only places open were pizza places. This leaked to the public and has now been referred to as the pizza meter and remains a joke to this day, with people posting screenshots of the Domino's activity tracker, and if there's a sudden uptick, well, just tell yourself nothing ever happens. We've discussed several events that people consider the start of the Cold War, and most of them have taken place in Europe, but now we can journey across the world to Canada. Prior to World War II, the Soviet Union and Canada had no diplomatic relations, but with their unified fight against Germany, the Soviets opened their first embassy in Ottawa in June of 1942. But these intentions weren't exactly noble. With the establishment of an embassy, the Soviets began an espionage ring across North America. And now we can introduce Igor Gozinko, a member of the Red Army trained as an intelligence officer now assigned to this post in Ottawa. He was living there with his wife, and they were shocked to see the frivolities Canada had during a time of war. He and his family lived here for 2 years before suddenly being recalled to the Soviet Union in September of 1944, even though he was said to be in Canada for 2 more years. However, Gozinko loved Canada, and he didn't want to go back to the Soviet Union. He was able to delay his leave by a year, and on September 5th, 1945, he walked out of the Soviet embassy for the last time. Gozinko sought help from several sources in Canada, but no one believed his story. After all, the Soviet Union and Canada were friends. Eventually, Gozinko and his family were taken into protective custody, where they revealed their full story and the extent of the espionage as they knew it. It wasn't just Canada that wanted to talk to him. He met with Harry Truman and Clement Attlee to tell him what the Soviets knew. This is where some people believe the Cold War started. Gozinko and his family were made citizens of Canada, and they lived the rest of their lives there in peace. Remember Broken Arrows? This is our first to discuss, and it's probably the most famous. On January 23rd, 1961, a B-52 was headed to Canada from North Carolina, and after an aerial refueling, the plane doing so noticed a leak. After the B-52 continued its flight, the leak worsened and over 30,000 pounds of fuel were lost. The plane kept breaking apart, leading to the crew abandoning it above Goldsboro. The crew survived, but the plane crashed to the ground with 2 nuclear missiles on board. They crashed into the ground, and one was recovered, but the other one is still missing. However, the bomb that was found was 1 safety switch away from exploding, and if it did explode, estimates placed the death toll at around 2,000. As for the lost bomb, it's in North Carolina somewhere, alongside a certain YouTuber. Georgy Markov was a Bulgarian journalist who began to have his work censored by this communist regime. He moved to Italy and intended on coming back to his home once he had a better relationship with the authorities, but ended up staying with the Western countries. This upset the Bulgarian officials, who took his works from all their libraries. This in turn upset Georgy, who began to write pieces critical of the Bulgarian government while living in London. Now this upset the Bulgarian government, who dispatched an assassin who saw Markov in London. So, he stabbed him, but with an umbrella. Georgy was confused, but just kind of went on with his life. 4 days later, he was dead. That umbrella had a tip with a pneumatic device that injected a poison pellet into Markov, killing him. What was that poison? Ricin. Yes, it's not just a thing in Breaking Bad. Ricin was a real poison, and Walter actually mentions this exact story. As World War II ended, a group known as the Hukbong-Bayan Laban Sahapan, or the People's Army Against Japan, or just simply called the Huk, which is what I'm going to call them, pushed for a more free Philippines, as America was meddling with their elections. Now, America wanted to continue to meddle in the elections, so they began to fight the Huk. Not wanting a full-on conflict, America researched the local area's mythology, and they uncovered the Aswang. The Aswang were reported shape-shifting cannibal creatures, and America faked attacks from them to scare away the Huk. CIA operatives would kidnap Huk fighters, kill them, drain them of their blood, and would leave their bodies around to be found. This rightfully scared the Huk, and I don't blame them. I would be pretty scared if I found my best friend drained of blood and left the area, helping America in their fight against them. The Red Scare creeped its way through every aspect of American culture, including the figurehead of all American entertainment, Walt Disney. Beginning in the 1940s, Walt Disney spied on all of his employees, attempting to find any signs of communist supporters. Most of these investigations were into potential unions being formed, and he was called to testify in front of Congress over these investigations and their findings. When Richard Nixon was in office, he had several hostile communist nations looking at the United States, and he had a unique way of dealing with them. He and his administration attempted to make the communists believe that Nixon was irrational and volatile so they would not provoke the United States, fearing an unpredictable response. Nixon himself deemed it madman theory, stating, "I want the North Vietnamese to think I've reached a point where I might do anything to stop this war." It's not just Vietnam. In October of 1969, the Nixon administration told the Soviet Union that the madman was loose, and the United States military was ordered to full readiness as bombers armed with thermonuclear weapons flew over the Soviet Union. I remember watching the Oppenheimer movie, and when it's discovered that Jean Tatlock, Oppenheimer's first romantic interest, took her own life, I noticed a short scene where a gloved hand grabs her head, and I thought to myself, oh, she was assassinated. So imagine my surprise when I saw no one discuss this scene. But then imagine my surprise when I realized that this was a conspiracy, that this was the way the filmmakers showed it. Jean Tatlock was a student at the University of Berkeley in California, the same school Robert Oppenheimer was teaching at. The two met through a fundraiser for communists in Spain, and they would soon begin a relationship that would end with him proposing twice and her saying no twice. So Oppenheimer broke it off and began dating Kitty Harrison, who he would soon marry. We're now in the time of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, and Oppenheimer would leave rather once or a few times to meet Jean Tatlock. Regardless of how many times he did so, on June 14, 1943, the two met in San Francisco, having dinner and spending the night together, an encounter monitored by the US Army. The next morning, Jean told Oppenheimer she still loved him, but he left, and this was the last time they saw each other, because Kitty took her own life soon after. But it's thought she wasn't the one to do this. Some believe she was assassinated. It's believed this was done because of the details Oppenheimer told her of the Manhattan Project. Jean was still a communist, and this communist now knew details of America's greatest military project. Before the team of Apollo 11 left the moon, they were given one last task. They had been sent up to the moon with memorial items dedicated to Russian cosmonauts who had lost their lives in the push for space. The items were as follows: an Apollo 1 patch for the astronauts who lost their lives during so, 2 Soviet medals, one for Vladimir Komarov and Yuri Gagarin, the first man to orbit the Earth, and finally, a small golden olive branch meant to usher in the armistice of the space race. SEAL Team 6 is a part of the United States Navy, and it's their special forces, dedicated to the most complex, dangerous, and classified missions. They have been dispatched for a multitude of reasons, including counterterrorism, hostage rescue, and assassinations. SEAL Team 6 was formed as a result of the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, right towards the end of the Cold War. The name SEAL Team 6 is curious, as its official name is the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, called DevGroup for short. At the time, there was a SEAL Team 1 and 2, and this team was named 6 to mislead the Soviet Union about how many teams there really were in total. Special agents in foreign nations had difficult tasks, passing along unspoken messages. Most commonly, this was done with Morse code. Like when Jeremiah Denton, an American POW in Vietnam, had to pass along a message. He was being used for propaganda, saying how well the POWs were being treated, but in reality, he was blinking the word torture in Morse code. But there were simpler methods implemented. These needed to be quiet and non-conspicuous, and the idea of lacing shoelaces differently was used. Since there's only 3 ways to do shoelaces, any oddities added would be an easy way to send a message without attracting attention. On screen is the various messages sent, but shoelaces were the only oddity in attire that agents used to send messages. Mismatched buttons, colored pocket squares, among others, were used to all pass messages along. While we discussed the involvement at Antarctica earlier, it wasn't the only frozen land the Americans were interested in, and now we can head north to Greenland and discuss Project Iceworm. Project Iceworm was the idea of installing missile launch sites under the Greenland ice, so they could reach Soviet lands in case a strike was needed. To test the feasibility of this plan, the American government set up a base called Camp Sentry in 1960 under the guise of a simple military research base. But in reality, they began plans of 2,500 miles of underground ice tunnels. But after 5 years of construction, it was discovered that Greenland was moving too fast, like the whole island was moving too fast. And this would soon collapse the tunnels and underground bases, making this one big waste of time. The funniest part is, America came to Denmark, who owns Greenland, just with the idea of Camp Century, a place to test construction under frigid conditions. Project Iceworm was never discussed. On August 18, 1945, a man simply going by Sukarno became the first president of Indonesia. He was basically given the office after he led the independence movement against the occupying Dutch colonists, and he remained popular through all 7 years of his presidency. Now, when we think of the Cold War, of course we're thinking about Russia and America battling a war of ideology. But this fight popped up all over the world, and it eventually found itself in Indonesia, the largest population of communists outside of Russia itself. Sukarno was a complicated case. While not identifying as a communist himself, he had several communist beliefs, causing Moscow and Washington to fight over his approval for years. This entry focuses at Russia's attempt at getting Sukarno on their side, but their attempt was less than friendly, and it involved blackmail. Sukarno was known to be a lover of multiple partners, and the Soviets hoped to exploit this. On a state visit to Moscow in 1960, the Russians have opted to have several women with him on the flight, and Sukarno couldn't resist, and he, along with one of the flight attendants, engaged in adult activities, which the Soviets recorded. Upon learning of this, Sukarno laughed at the Soviets, asked if he could see the tapes, and when he saw them, he asked for copies to take home and show his country. It's assumed the Russians didn't oblige, because the Sukarno tapes have never been seen. While the United States and USSR were having a squabble, China was fighting their own demons, birds. The War of Sparrows was a part of the Four Pest campaign in China, an attempt to remove mosquitoes, rats, flies, and sparrows from the Chinese ecosystem. Mosquitoes carried malaria, rodents spread the plague, the flies were just annoying, and sparrows were eating all of the nation's grain. So Mao Zedong ordered for them to be killed. Chinese citizens formed groups in the millions to kill the birds, with them smashing their nests, killing chicks, or just simply shooting them out of the sky. They would also clang pots and pans outside their nests so the birds couldn't get any sleep, causing them to die of exhaustion. After 2 years of this, Chinese citizens noticed something way too late. Sparrows also ate locusts. Now, with no sparrows left to eat these insects, they ate everything. This led to a widespread famine that killed upwards of 45 million people. China quickly realized their mistake, and they imported 250,000 sparrows from the Soviet Union. In 1961, on a visit to the United States, Nikita Khrushchev spoke to Jackie Kennedy about Shrelka, a dog that had previously gone to space as a part of a Soviet spy mission, and had puppies beforehand. Jackie wanted one, and Khrushchev obliged, shipping a puppy named Pushninka to the White House. Before the dog was given to the president, she was checked out at the Walter Reed Military Hospital to make sure no listening device had been planted, and one had not. So Pushninka was given to the Kennedys. One of the Kennedys' own dogs mated with Pushninka and had 4 puppies that Kennedy called Pupniks. Over 5,000 letters came in with the public wanting these puppies, and they were given out to 4 people. Fast forward to 2024, and descendants of Pushninka are still living.
Hello, Margaret Thatcher, yes?
If I were there, Margaret, I'd throw my hat in the door before I came in.
Oh, no, there's no need to do that.
Listen, we regret very much the embarrassment that's been caused you, and I'd just like to tell you what the story is from our end.
This is the phone call Ronald Reagan made to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher on October 25th, 1983, as the United States had just invaded Grenada, and this was done without a consultation to the United Kingdom. Let's explain what was going on in Grenada at the time. They had just gained independence from the United Kingdom in May of 1974, but 5 years later, a communist political party called the New Jewel Movement took over in a coup, and now Maurice Bishop was in control. Maurice began to lead Grenada in a socialistic manner, and began to work with Eastern Bloc European countries, something DC was not liking. They even began construction of a new airport officially for tourism reasons, but Washington was worried it was being made for Soviet use. Maurice would visit with the United States, something viewed unfavorably in Grenada, so upon his return, He and some of his supporters were gunned down. The commander of the military, Paul Schoon, took control. Soon after this, members of the Caribbean states called for a United States intervention, to which they did. The United States invaded Grenada on October 25, 1983, without informing their allies, prompting that beginning phone call. In the early 1960s, the United States Army lost 2 nuclear submarines in the Atlantic Ocean, the USS Thresher in 1963 and the Scorpion in 1968, and there was a mission launched in 1982 to find these submarines. But the United States government didn't want the Soviets to know this is what was being done, so a cover story was made. They weren't looking for nuclear submarines, they were looking for the wreck of the Titanic. The Titanic sank in 1915, and in '83, a Navy officer named Robert Ballard petitioned for the funding of diving equipment to find the Titanic. And this was approved so long as Robert looked for the nuclear submarines first. Robert agreed, and not only did he find the submarines with 11 days left in his mission, he also found the wreck of the Titanic. As the Soviets spied on the Washington, D.C. complex, they noticed hundreds of agents going in and out of some strange building right in the middle of the Pentagon. And considering this was in the middle, and so many agents were going in and out of it, the Soviets believed this was the most important meeting place on the entire complex. So naturally, they had several nuclear missiles aimed at it through the entire Cold War. However, this wasn't a place the CIA were holding secretive meetings, it was a hot dog stand. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the subsequent rise of Castro, concerns remained high surrounding Cuba. In late 1961, consultants and observers of the island nation mentioned how several soccer fields were being built along the coast, and this sent up warnings at Washington, D.C. Soccer wasn't popular in Cuba, baseball was. But you know where soccer was popular? Russia. This is what started the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Angola gained independence from the Portuguese on November 11, 1975, a civil war soon broke out. One side, the MPLA, was pro-communist, while the UNITA was anti-communist and was being backed by South Africa. Now let's discuss the island nation of Cuba. Fidel Castro wanted to spread communism as far as he could, yet he didn't endorse battles closer to home, like the one currently taking place in Nicaragua, as he was afraid of provoking the United States. But Angola was nowhere near the United States. Fidel also saw the appeal of communism in Africa, thinking it could start in Angola and spread through the entire continent. So Cuba launched an invasion of Angola. 40,000 Angolan and 35,000 Cuban soldiers worked together to push South Africa out of their country. On September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was scheduled to leave New York City, cross through Anchorage, Alaska, with a final destination in Seoul. However, due to a mistake with the flight nav, it accidentally crossed into Soviet airspace, and was consequently shot down. This was due to the Soviets believing it was an American spy plane. The plane was shot out of the sky, and its debris crashed into the Sea of Japan. All 269 souls on board, including a United States representative, were killed. Due to the Cold War, no details of the debris search were shared with the West, and the United States accused the Soviet Union of covering up and hampering the search, while the Union claimed this was a provocation from the States. Regardless of what it was, 269 innocent lives were lost that day due to this Cold War incident. Keeping information gathering discreet was a running theme during the Cold War, and we're back again with another tool that spies used. This time, one's based out of the Soviet Union. Russian KGB agents would hollow out the heels of their shoe to make room for a microphone, a transmitter, and batteries, turning the agents into a walking radio station, able to pick up on any conversation without raising suspicion. A man sat outside the USSR embassy in Washington, D.C., when he began to notice a dragonfly that seemed to follow him. It stayed in his vicinity, moving with him as he would walk. He thought nothing of it, just an annoying bug. But what he didn't know was that a recording was just made of him, because that wasn't a dragonfly, it was the Insectothopter. This was revealed by the CIA in 2003, and it's a micro, unmanned aerial vehicle with a camera inside. The thing was originally designed to resemble a bumblebee, but it was found a dragonfly had more balance. It's not known how much this thing was used, only that it was used. So next time that fly or bug or dare I say bird sticks around a little longer than it should, maybe be careful with what you're saying around it. During the Cold War, China and the Soviet Union played a pivotal role as both individuals and as a partnership. On February 14, 1950, Mao Zedong met with Joseph Stalin where they renewed the Sino-Soviet alliance, forming a bond between these two massive Soviet superpowers. Once Stalin was out of the picture and Nikita Khrushchev was in, the new Russian leader began to denounce the previous and began the process of de-Stalinization. China and the Soviet Union had a shaky relationship anyways, and after Mao was embarrassed during a meeting in 1949, he took his revenge 8 years later during Khrushchev's second visit to Beijing. On the second day of this meeting, Mao insisted it be done in a pool. The Chinese leader loved to swim, but Khrushchev never learned how to. However, Khrushchev reluctantly obliged, but remained in the kids section of the pool while Mao started doing laps around the entire place. Eventually, he invited the Russian leader into the deeper end, and he once again obliged. But before he went to the deep end, he was given a pair of floaters for his arms. So now, Mao Zedong was diving and swimming laps and trying to conduct a meeting on foreign policy while Khrushchev was struggling to stay afloat. Relationships between China and the Soviet Union did not last much longer after this. Animals played a vital part through the Cold War, and we mentioned earlier the acoustic cat program, but now we can discuss how the United States Air Force would drug bears to the point of unconsciousness to load them into fighter planes and then launch them out to test their new ejector seats. In the 1950s, the B-58, a new fighter jet, was being developed, and this fighter jet could reach speeds of Mach 2, or about 1,500 miles per hour. But this brought up the problem of ejection, because ejecting at that speed was beyond dangerous. American pilots were testing this system, and they were dying. So a new test subject was chosen, the American black bear. So beginning in 1962, young American black bears were sedated and launched 225 feet above the B-58's flight path, about 35,000 feet in total, and floated to the ground, a process that took 8 minutes. And with the new ejector seat system, the bear was completely safe and made it out unharmed. What you're watching is a video that was never meant to be seen. Or, if it was to be seen, it would be the last thing you would see. This was the Turner Doomsday Video, which was made to be broadcasted at the end of the world. In 1980, the now massive news company CNN was founded by Ted Turner, and prior to the network's launch, Turner was afraid of a possible doomsday scenario, so he had this video created. This is a performance of the Christian hymn Near My God to Thee. It was actually recorded right after the famous recording of the Star-Spangled Banner, which would be the sign-off song for the network. And Turner asked the band to also play the song, so that CNN would be live until the end of days. And if that end of days came, they would be there till the very last moment. Ah, Las Vegas, Sin City. They say if you see it once, you'll never be the same again, and I have to agree. Seeing the strip at nighttime is beautiful, but with modern day visits, we're missing out on that full Las Vegas experience in the 1950s, back when the Mafia was running the place. Sure, you could go and gamble your house away and watch Elvis shit himself live on stage. You could also see something that we're missing out on now, a nuclear test. During the 1950s, America was looking for an area to test out their nuclear weapons. Previously, they were bombing random Pacific islands, but this proved to be a logistical nightmare getting bombs out there. So a continental solution was put forward, an area uninhabited by man, the Nevadan Desert. So through the 1940s and 50s, Operation Teapot began, which allowed for nuclear detonations in the Nevadan Desert, a mere 100 miles away from the Las Vegas Strip. And if anything in that area is going to be monetized, it was going to be. Special announcements would be made before the test began, allowing guests to pause their gambling to come out and view the mushroom cloud. This is why there's such an atomic influence in Las Vegas, with several sites dedicated to the history of testing, most notably the Atomic Museum, detailing the full history of the atom and its effects on Sin City. In June of 1967, a fisherman off the coast of Florida found a floating crate labeled Property of the USSR, with a shipping address labeled to the Institute of Mineral Resources of Cuba. The box was turned over to the American authorities, and they investigated its contents. Inside were several yellow balloons, all inflated and closed with rubber stoppers. The gas inside the balloons was tested, to which it was found to just be oxygen. So why was the Soviet Union delivering several inflated balloons to this island nation? It's a good question, one that remains unanswered to this day. Theories exist, ranging from it being packing material, to it being shipped by mistake, whether it was mispacked or something was left out, or the boring one, it's a hoax. Some propaganda play from either side. We're back again in the wacky toolbox spies had at their disposal, and now we can cover 5-second masks. During the Cold War, the American government worked closely with artists to develop a way spies could completely change their faces in a matter of seconds. These things were made of silicone, and they were made to just slide over one's face to gain a new face. This sounds like something right out of Hollywood, because it is. The American government worked closely with Hollywood artists, more specifically, the ones behind the Planet of the Apes to develop these masks. And of course, this trope has popped up in blockbuster films, with the greatest example being Black Widow and Winter Soldier. In April of 1950, a United States PB-4Y-2 privateer was on a scheduled flight from a town in Germany to the NATO Air Force Base in Copenhagen, Denmark. But this plane never made it. A message was sent out across the entire NATO command, and investigations began. But it wouldn't be a member of NATO to come forward with the details, it was Russia. They claimed that this plane flew over occupied Latvia, and once questioned and asked for details, it opened fire, to which Russia returned fire, shooting it down. So now we enter the typical back and forth bickering of Cold War governments. America kept with their claim that the turbulent turtle was nothing but an aircraft making a routine flight, which Russia claimed it to be on a reconnaissance mission. One of these sides were lying, and 25 years after the takedown, the lie was revealed. And it was America. The turtle was indeed a part of a reconnaissance mission, attempting to locate Soviet radar stations should a war begin. But it was also revealed Russia was lying, because all spy planes were stripped of their ordnance, making an initial firing impossible. On August 4th, 1945, children from the Soviet Union were visiting a United States ambassador with a gift, a wooden plaque, with the United States official seal carved into it. This was a gift to W.R. Uval Harriman, the ambassador from the United States to the Soviet Union, and it hung in his office for 7 years. In 1951, British radio operators heard American conversations coming from an open Soviet channel, leading to the investigation of a bug, and it was found that this carved seal had a concealed radio in it. We've discussed, and will continue to discuss, the way spies attempted to stay hidden during the Cold War, but there were contingencies in case they were caught, and here's our first, having a completely fake name, backstory, and everything. This is Jerry Szokmarek, a Polish spy who was sent to Germany on a secret mission. But Jerzy wouldn't enter Germany. Jonas Arnold would. Arnold was the real name of a German citizen, who was dropped off at an orphanage at the age of 1. Now Jonas was posing as this orphan to enter the country, on a mission to find his birth mother. He actually did find the family, and continued the lie even after his fake mother passed away shortly after the visit. Using these new family connections, he was able to secure employment as a German bureaucrat, where he continued to ingrain himself within the local society, all the while feeding information back home. But his cover was blown in the funniest way possible, when the real Jonas Arnold came to Germany, also looking for his birth mother. And German authorities were like, wait a minute, this is sounding very familiar. So Jerzy's cover was blown. When we think of Cold War close calls, of course the Cuban Missile Crisis is the first idea, but there was a time we were even closer. For those who don't know, the DEFCON system basically shows how close we are to war. It's a 1 to 5 scale, 5 being the lowest, times of peace. And 1 means find your local Vault Tech rep. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was at a 2. During the Able Archer incident, it was at a 1. Able Archer was a drill taking place between NATO countries, simulating a rise in tensions with the aforementioned DEFCON 1 scale. New communication exercises were also being implemented, including radio silence between the NATO members. Meanwhile, the Warsaw Pact countries saw all of this taking place, and they believed it was go time. Air units in East Germany and Poland were air units in East Germany and Poland were placed on high alert, and their nuclear stockpile was activated. But of course, no response was given, and this kind of just festered out. If you did not know, I live in West Virginia, a state that borders the capital of the United States. Because of this, we have been involved in a lot of American history, and our biggest story of the Cold War is probably the bunker made to house Congress. It's located under the Greenbrier Resort in Greenbrier County, a luxury getaway hotel and golf course. In the late 50s, Operation Greek Island was created, which entailed the construction of this vault that would hold all members of Congress and the President's cabinet. The bunker features beddings, kitchens, hospitals, and a communications area, all to keep the government in order should the worst outcome arrive. The bunker was decommissioned in 1992 and remains at the resort today, where tours are given. It wasn't just the West that Stalin was paranoid of, he was paranoid of his own friends. And when Mao Zedong visited the Soviet Union, Stalin launched several investigations against the Chinese leader, and this is probably the weirdest one. Prior to Mao's visit, special toilets were installed for him at his hotel, and these toilets were not connected to the city sewer. They were connected to special boxes. So Mao would do his business, which was collected, and sent to a lab for analysis. The Russians were looking for any medication he might be on, revealing any health problems, whether mental or physical. Nothing was found, and when Stalin was out and Khrushchev was in, he canceled the program. On September 22nd, 1979, an American Vela satellite was over the South African territory of Prince Edward Island, located at about the halfway point between Africa and Antarctica. The Vela satellite picked up on a double flash, and radars and sensors picked up the telltale signs of a nuclear detonation. So the following day, President Jimmy Carter called a meeting to discuss what just happened. The most obvious suspect was South Africa, considering it was their territory, and they were known to be working on a bomb. But suspicion then fell into Israel, who were close friends with South Africa and were known to have nuclear bombs. But no nation came forward and claimed responsibility for the double flash. Notice I keep calling this thing a double flash and not a nuclear test, as there are theories claiming it wasn't a test and it was instead a meteor hitting the Vela satellite, which would produce a result similar to a nuclear flash. Regardless, the Vela incident remains exactly that, an incident, with no one knowing exactly what it was. On October 12, 1960, Nikita Khrushchev was attending a United Nations meeting that was being held in New York City. During the meeting, the delegate from the Philippines, Lorenzo Sumilong, mentioned the citizens of Eastern Europe and their struggles for civil and political rights, and this upset Khrushchev, who rose to speak or yell because he was angry, and he dismissed Lorenzo with his hand before he began a tirade of rage. Lorenzo tried to speak again, and this pushed Khrushchev completely past his boiling point. He pounded his fist into the desk and even took off his own shoe and started beating it against the desk. This further devolved into arguments between the Eastern Bloc countries, and it ended with an adjournment. Khrushchev went home, where he was criticized for embarrassing the country, but Nikita himself never expressed regret. Once World War II settled, nations around the world recognized the threat of Soviet domination, and they responded in their various ways. And the Canadian response was to make a plane so powerful, their nation would never be threatened again. The Canadian Air Force commissioned a plane capable of reaching Mach 2 speed while maintaining altitudes of 50,000 feet. A tall order to say the least. This plane will be called the Avro Arrow, and it entered production the same day Sputnik was launched into space. And 2 years later, the first one was finished. But once these things were finished, the conversation of interceptors taking down bombers was no longer a concern, considering the now preferable way to deliver a nuclear payload was long-range missile sites. So production of these things were scrapped, citing the ballooning cost and the aforementioned loss of relevance. But there are conspiracies about the Avro Arrow. It's thought the USA fed Canada fake information about these missile sites, so that Canada would cancel production of these planes, considering they were far superior compared to what the United States currently had. Regardless, the Avro Arrow was scrapped, and surviving ones are able to be seen at various shows and museums in Canada. On the evening of December 9th, 1965, residents of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania looked towards the sky as a massive fireball plummeted towards Earth. It crashed in the woods, and the entire area was immediately quarantined by the United States military and local state police. Officially, nothing was found, but locals at Kecksburg reported a military flatbed trailer hauling off an acorn-shaped device. The story picks back up in 2002, where the Sci-Fi Channel, of all people, filed a lawsuit against NASA for more information about what really happened in Kecksburg. NASA stonewalled several attempts at this before they finally revealed details of what happened in 2009. It was a Soviet satellite. Alright, that's boring. Let's talk about the conspiracy theories. This is Die Glocke, or the Bell, a reported wonder weapon of Germany. In the final years of the war, Germany began the development of several strange wonder weapons, and this may have been one of them. And he described the machine as a 12-foot tall, 9-foot wide, glowing contraption filled with a purple liquid. Igor had no idea what this machine's purpose was. He speculated it may have been an anti-gravity device, or maybe even something to time travel with. Anyone who knew a Die Glocke was supposed to be murdered by the SS, and the machine was supposedly traded by Hans Kammler, the head of the Wonder Weapons program, to the United States in exchange for his freedom. But, is there any evidence of this thing, or was this Polish dude just spreading misinformation for fun? Well, he was allegedly supplied with a top-secret Polish military document that detailed all of this. So it's one long, complicated game of telephone. It's true, at the end of the war, America sent teams into Germany to secure scientists and military technology before other powers, namely the Soviet Union, could capture them. And maybe they brought home a 12-foot tall mystery bell machine with them. As for Kecksburg, people have speculated that this thing that crashed was Die Glocke, or a repurposed Die Glocke that crashed. When we compare the reported shape of both of these things, they're pretty similar, but that's a pretty big reach. When Castro took power in Cuba, rumors of him removing parental rights began to swirl, both with Cuban immigrants in the United States and citizens still living on the island. The rumors were furthered by the CIA, who broadcasted the message around the island of Cuba: Castro is going to take your children and place them in the Soviet Union. These claims had no evidence and were meant to scare the parents of the island, and it worked, as over the next 2 years, 14,000 children were moved from Cuba to the United States, with their parents remaining behind. This was a logistical mess, as Foster's home in Miami, the primary area of relocation, were not equipped to deal with this influx of children. It was thought Fidel would not be in power for very long, and once he was removed, the children would be sent back home. But Fidel died in 2016, not 1962, so the children remained, and were sent all over the country. Most of them never saw Cuba again. Once the Bay of Pigs was determined to be a failure, the Americans did not give up on their attempts at removing Fidel Castro, and began to implement new plans of removal, and these became known as Operation Mongoose. But Mongoose centered less around a direct American removal, but instead planned for a discrediting of the Castro regime, so the people of Cuba would remove him. Edward Lansdale was put in charge of this, and he was the guy responsible for the counterinsurgency missions in the Philippines and Vietnam. If you're familiar with the time the CIA faked vampire attacks in the Philippines, this was that program's leader. Lansdale wasn't working alone, and one side he took to working with was the Mafia. He also worked with Cuban exiles and citizens of Cuba who wanted Castro out. Now, we've already discussed the weird assassination attempts in the Bay of Pigs, all part of Operation Mongoose, but these new plans looked at toppling the infrastructure of the country. Areas like sugar mills and fields and whatever else would explode was targeted. It wasn't just a physical attack either. Radio stations broadcasted anti-Castro messages claiming high-ranking officials were about to defect from the island. After all of these efforts, it's been determined that Operation Mongoose was a failure. In the beginning stages of the Cold War, President Dwight Eisenhower permitted U-2 spy planes to fly over the Soviet Union on surveillance missions, and Russia was not happy about this. So on May 1st, 1960, a U-2 plane piloted by Francis Powers took off from an airfield in Pakistan on one of these spy missions, to which the Soviet Union responded by shooting down the plane. Francis survived and was taken into Russian custody. So now DC had a problem. These spy missions were supposed to be kept a secret, and now Russia had one of these spies in their custody. The Russians confronted Eisenhower, to which he admitted to conducting spy missions. Gary was then sentenced to 10 years in prison for espionage, but only served for 2, as the USSR and USA conducted their first spy swap, in which a Russian spy was released in exchange for Gary. One of the most vital, yet forgotten players during the Cold War was Dag Hammarskjöld. He was the second Secretary General of the United Nations between the years of 1953 to 63, a position that put him front and center with many global problems. Dag is the brainchild for the more peacekeeping side of things in the United Nations, and helped organize deals in Asia, Africa, and Europe in his 8 years as second general. But unfortunately, he does not find himself on our list for his legacy as a leader. He's on here because of his strange death. On September 18th, 1961, Dag was on a flight to the Congo to help mediate a peaceful solution between UN forces and Moise Tshombe. Unfortunately, he never made it to his destination, as his plane went down near modern-day Zambia. The conspiracy comes from the plane's cause of crashing. It's officially reported that the planes crashed due to a piloting error, but others, including Harry Truman, believed it was shot down. It's also theorized a hijacker took control of the plane and crashed it, but no one knows why that plane went down, and it remains unsolved to this day. We're back to passing along encoded messages, and anytime a spy would need to talk to someone, it posed a risk for them being caught. So unspoken methods were implemented, and this one used a hollowed-out cemetery spike. Cemetery spikes are usually vases made to hold flowers, but spies would carry these into graveyards, plant them into the ground, and leave. But they weren't honoring a fallen family member, they were passing along messages, as a spy handler would later come and retrieve the spike. On April 20th, 1978, airline flight 902 left Paris en route for Seoul, South Korea, but they had a layover in Alaska. Similar to Flight 007, this was done to avoid entering Soviet airspace. But due to the cold weather affecting the plane's navigation, after leaving Alaska, it was intercepted and shot down by a Soviet fighter jet, and 2 people lost their lives. The plane landed on a frozen Russian lake, so now it's time to investigate, to which the Russian authorities refused to do so. The captain of the flight claimed to be cooperating with the Russian fighter jets, while Russian authorities claimed Flight 902 wasn't responding to their calls, prompting the shoot down. Flight 902 is still in service today, flying the same route of Paris to Seoul, but now they don't have to worry about entering Soviet airspace. As a part of the Soviet and Cuban Joint Alliance, a signal base inside Havana entered construction. This was the Lord Signal Base, and at its peak, over 1,500 people worked here, making it the largest Soviet signal base outside of the actual Union. The base closed in 2002, but actually reopened in 2014. It seems to be more relevant in our modern times, as people believe Cuba is helping enemies of the United States spy on our country via the Lord Signal Base, mainly China, but these are all rumors. The Olvik Senior was a Norwegian fishing vessel that mysteriously disappeared in 1978. It was crewed by 9 people, all of which remain missing to this day. Once the ship went down, its remains were found, but the crew were not. The captain was a well-known local, who was incredibly experienced, so a navigational error seemed unlikely. Also, other fishing boat captains active in the area were asked if there was any strange goings-on on that day, and they reported that unidentified ships were lurking around, giving rise to the theory that a Soviet submarine was in the area and sank the Olvik Senior. However, this event has mostly been forgotten to history, and I should have put it lower down because finding any information on this thing was hard, made harder by the fact I can't speak Norwegian. On May 28, 1987, this 18-year-old amateur pilot named Matthias Rust flew from Helsinki, Finland to Moscow with no permission. He landed right in Red Square, where he was promptly arrested. Rust wanted to do this to reduce tensions between the two sides, but instead earned himself 4 years of prison time. He did all of this with less than 50 hours of flight time. He was tracked during the entire duration of the flight and was almost shot down, but the Soviets didn't know fully what to do, so they kind of just let him in. The United Kingdom and United States were worried that since Russia was now considered a nuclear power, a strike on either one of their nations was imminent. In response to their own fears, plans of bugging the headquarters of the Soviet Union and their slice of Berlin began. The CIA and MI6 wanted to tap into the phone line specifically, so plans for a tunnel to be dug between the split city began. To begin their operations, a non-conspicuous warehouse was built on the United States sector of Berlin, and the tunnel would stretch from this into the Russian side. The tunnel ran for 1,500 feet and stretched under the Soviet military headquarters. The Western countries could not break the Soviet encryption used at the base, but were instead hoping that secrets would be spilled over unsecured lines. Eventually, the tunnel was found, and the Soviets were rightfully upset. In the early 1970s, plans for a new Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. began, and the construction began in 1977. Washington, D.C. had plans to bug this new building, but the Russians would be expecting this. In fact, they planned for it. The walls were made of thick marble so bugs could not be hidden inside, and they checked every window and door and wherever else they could for bugs. So if the Americans wanted to bug the place, they had to be covert. So once the embassy site was selected, the FBI purchased a 3-story building across the street, and the main event of Operation Monopoly began, another plan to tunnel into a building, while planting surveillance equipment during the entire dig. The tunnel entered construction before the embassy was even finished. This was an expensive process, and I'll spoil it now because nothing was found. Partially due to the fact that there was a rat in Operation Monopoly. An FBI agent named Robert Hansen was revealing top-shelf information to the Soviets in exchange for money, and he spilled the details of Operation Monopoly. He spilled the details in '89, and the embassy was fully in use in '94, so the Soviets never had to worry about letting their conversations slip. Later down, we're going to discuss Starfish Prime, where the United States was detonating nuclear bombs in the Pacific Ocean. But we can talk about one of these bombs now. On September 6th, 1962, the United States detonated a 1.4 megaton nuke 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean, making it the most powerful high-altitude nuclear test. This explosion created an electrostatic pulse so powerful that its effects were felt for days. 4 days after the detonation, the United Kingdom's first ever satellite was suddenly fried, and after days of an investigation, it was found that the United States nuclear detonation was responsible for this. Being a spy in a foreign country was an incredibly difficult task, and if one were to be discovered, the consequences were going to be severe. If you remember the Rosebergs, for example, they were executed, and this set a standard among spies, instilling fears of death or something worse. So a quick get-out-of-jail-free card was made. Cyanide glasses. This was a simple modification made to a spy's glasses, where a tiny hole would be drilled and a cyanide tablet was put inside. This would be for a captured spy, who, facing interrogation or torture, could inconspicuously chew on the end of their glasses, taking themselves out before arousing suspicion. While we discussed spies keeping things hidden several times, they have all involved intelligence gathering in one form or another. But don't be mistaken, these guys were ready to defend themselves if it came to that, so weapons were also hidden on them. Towards the end of World War II, development on the Sedgley OSS, more commonly referred to as the fist gun or glove pistol, began. This is a single-shot, break-action 38 caliber pistol handed out to Allied soldiers as part of OSS operations in the Pacific Theater. These things weren't super widespread, with only about 100 of them being made in their lifespan. The thing was fired when the user would make a fist, and pushing the trigger towards themselves, and it was meant for covert assassinations or if someone was in a life-or-death situation. As people listened into the Soviet radios, operatives around the world began to complain about a specific noise that would interrupt legit broadcast. It was a sharp, repetitive tapping noise, earning it the nickname of the Russian woodpecker. Spies began to craft conspiracy theories about this signal, claiming it was a form of brainwashing among other things. However, it was nothing exciting. It was one of the Soviet Duga radars, used in their early warning systems. It was made sometime in 1976, and reports of the woodpecker soon appeared. People wanted this thing gone because of how annoying it was, and a club called the Russian Woodpecker Hunter was made for this exact reason. But the Duga, or the woodpecker, went away on its own. It became less frequent in the 80s, and by 1989, it disappeared entirely. if there's one sound that's universally hated, it's air sirens. When you hear these things, it's a sign of impending doom, and during the Cold War, if you were to hear these things, fears of a nuclear strike were on the minds of everyone around. The Cold War also saw the rise and development of louder sirens, as governments were convinced their citizens were going to need warned, and this gave rise to the Chrysler Air Raid siren, the loudest siren ever made. 6 of these things were made and placed around Los Angeles County, and once in operation, they had an output of 138 decibels, which is loud, to say the least. Some of these things are still around, and they still stand in cities, but they're non-operational, while some of them have been taken down and placed into private individuals' collections. This is Felix Moncla, a pilot for the United States Air Force who is considered missing in action, presumed to be dead. On the evening of November 23rd, 1953, people stationed at a radio base in Michigan spotted something strange flying over Lake Superior, and Moncla was dispatched to investigate. Moncla showed up on the radar with the object, and he was flying to intercept, when the two blips merged. It was assumed he flew under whatever this thing was, and the blip would pop back up, but it didn't. The two dots stayed merged and flew away. Back at the base, people tried to reach Moncla, but he wouldn't respond. So a search and rescue mission was launched, but nothing was found. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing. At first, the thing Moncla was chasing was labeled as a UFO, but this was retracted, and the story became that of a Canadian pilot, to which Canada came back and said no pilots were in that area. So what was this thing that Moncla was chasing, and where is he? Well, it's still up in the air. People believe it was an alien craft, and it had taken Felix's plane before disappearing. The more rational ones believe Felix crashed into the lake, and that's why his dot disappeared. But they seem to lack an explanation for what that initial dot was. Captain Charles Maltby was a pilot for the United States Air Force. He was on a routine reconnaissance mission, observing things in the North Pole, but a navigational mistake placed him right in the middle of the Soviet Union. Okay, this is like the third story of this happening, but we can't blame technology this time, it's all on the pilot. He was relying on celestial navigation, following the northern lights to the North Pole, but they dimmed, so he lost track of them and accidentally flew into Russia. Did we also mention this was right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because it was. The Soviets were worried Charles was flying in with a nuke, so they responded with their own jets armed with nuclear weapons. But it never went past this, as Charles glided out of the Soviet airspace. Oh yeah, he ran out of fuel during this, so just not the best day for him. I hope through this iceberg, you've been able to realize just how close we were on several instances, just how close we were to total nuclear annihilation. During the Cold War as a whole, we were close, and more specifically, the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many close calls we had is insane. Sin Sang-ok was a South Korean filmmaker best well known for his productions through the 50s and 60s. But he finds himself on a Cold War's mystery iceberg because of his kidnapping. In 1978, both Shin and his wife were in Hong Kong when the North Korean government kidnapped them. This is because the North Korean government, namely Kim Jong-il, wanted him to produce movies for the North Korean populace, since he was acclaimed in South Korea. So beginning in 1983, Shin directed 7 films, while Kim was breathing down his neck for the entire production. His best well-known movie in this time is Pulgasari, a North Korean knockoff of Godzilla. But in 1986, Shin and his wife were at Vienna attending a film festival when they went to the US Embassy in the city seeking asylum, which they were granted. They lived in Reston, Virginia for 2 years before moving to Los Angeles, and eventually back home to South Korea, where he would pass away peacefully. To get the American audience excited for the space race, several aspects of everyday American culture were molded to fit within a space theme. This is where rocket pops come from, which were made into the shape of a rocket with a red, white, and blue color scheme to get children excited for the space race. However, that one is more of a rumor, and it's not been stated as fact anywhere. But what is a fact is that through the late 50s and early 1960s, playground equipment across America and the USSR was made to resemble various aspects of the space race. From rocket-shaped towers to climbable satellites, this became a template for American children. By the time 1993 came along, the city of Philadelphia had 160 space-themed playgrounds alone. A lot of these space playgrounds have been phased out, but some remain still, and locals have fought to keep them installed. Like in 2008, when the city of Richardson, Texas had tried to replace their local playground, locals petitioned this, and it got stopped. During the 1970s and 90s, the Soviet Union began designs for something right out of Star Wars. A tank with mounted laser cannons designed to shoot down ICBMs, helicopters, and other tanks. Only 2 of these things were ever made, as the collapse of the Soviet Union halted production. One of the 2 was scrapped, and the other one is on display at the Army Technology Museum in Moscow. By the time 1988 came along, the Cold War was practically over, and the Soviet Union were getting rid of some of their nuclear stockpile. 72 Soviet missiles were set to be detonated at a desolate location, and the United States took this opportunity to observe and conduct studies on what exactly they had. So pilot Robert Hopkins was deployed for this task, but it quickly turned from a simple surveillance mission into something stranger. As we looked for traffic, we noticed what appeared to be a translucent, milky white wall rising from the left over the USSR to the right, towards the northern Pacific Ocean. It covered the entire sky, from ground level to as far up as we could see, looking out the front windows of the airplane. It moved very quickly, far faster than crossing airplane traffic, and rapidly approached us. These were the exact words of Robert Hopkins, as he described the now nicknamed Dome of Light. So what exactly was this thing he just saw? Theories range from a secret doomsday device to just a weird way fuel was burnt from a launched missile, but all of these are just theories, and the Soviet Dome of Light remains unsolved to this day. As the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, nations around Europe began to rid themselves of any trace of communism. Now enters Louis Carpenter, who's on a vacation to Europe. He was in Czechoslovakia in a random junkyard when he happened to see his new obsession, a massive, hollowed-out bronze Lenin statue, waiting to get melted down. Previously, this thing was commissioned in 1981 and was finished in '88, being put on display in Poprad, modern-day Slovakia. Louis wasn't leaving without this thing, so he offered to purchase it for a modern-day equivalent of 30,000 American dollars, and it cost him another 10,000 to ship it to his house. Yeah, this guy mortgaged his house to afford this. Carpenter wanted to put this thing in front of a Slovak restaurant back home, but then he died in a car crash in 1994, so now it belongs to his family, who do not want it. The statue is on display in Seattle, Washington, and it's for sale, like it has been since 1994, and the price is only going up. Right now, it's sitting at $290,000. And maybe this video does well, I'll buy it. While it's not agreed upon when the Cold War began, it's pretty well decided that it was over once the USSR broke up, which happened on December 26, 1991. But let's back up a couple of years. Lithuania was the first nation to leave the USSR and gain independence, happening in 1990. Their neighbors of Estonia and Latvia followed, as they all became independent at once in 1991. And from there, it was like a set of dominoes. Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, everyone was leaving, and the USSR was left with 2 members. You know Russia, but when they left, there was only one standing member, Kazakhstan. Yes, that's right. For 4 whole days, Kazakhstan was the only member of the USSR, meaning they made up the only land claim of the USSR. Convincing the Warsaw Pact countries to stay together in a band against the West was a tough task championed by propaganda, and the propaganda of the East was about to find a new figurehead in the potato beetle. Towards the end of World War II, the potato beetle found itself in several European nations, but all of these afflicted countries were able to wipe it out in its entirety. That was until the early 1950s, when East Germany potato fields were completely infested with the beetle, and the Soviets believed this was the West causing the infestations. Propaganda posters based on these accusations were made, and the Western countries responded by making stamps of the beetle, writing the word freedom on them, and then dropping these stamps across the Eastern Bloc countries. The Americans had very lofty goals for the moon before they even ever landed a man on the surface. But they figured, hey, while you're up there, Neil, you might as well build a facility to house personnel for scientific research purposes and to get a militaristic foothold on the rock. It was estimated nearly 150 Saturn rockets would need launched towards the moon containing components for this base's construction. If you remember the Davy Crockett from earlier, the low-yield nuclear launcher, basically Fallout's Fat Man, these were going to be the primary aspect of the base's defense. This thing never made it past the concept stage, as it was handed to President Dwight Eisenhower, and he basically said, "What the hell are you talking about? This is going to cost like $10 billion, and promptly threw the plans into the shredder. Should the Soviet Union go to war with America, they had plans to knock out entire infrastructures in hours, and these plans manifested themselves into Operation Cedar. The main area to be targeted was the American power supply, with massive dams across the country being targeted. Oil refineries and pipelines across the States and Canada were also targets, as was the Port of New York. This was nothing more than a plan. The furthest it went was the Soviet Union gathering photos of their exact points in the area to be targeted. But after a whole 13 years of development, Cedar was cancelled. When you think of America's missile depots, what are the states that come to mind? For me, it's Montana, or Wyoming, or really any state in the Rust Belt and central United States. Oklahoma is one of these states, but would it be anyone's first guess? I doubt it, but it should be, considering it was one of the United States' main depots during the Cold War. Between 1960 and 65, 12 missile silos were built across Oklahoma. But why are these states chosen? For one, they're empty. They're mostly flat expanses of land, which gives the perfect area to build missile silos at. For two, they're empty. There's not much of the population out there, so if the silos are targeted by nuclear power, you're not going to get much population loss. Criminals being given a Black Ops mission to take time off their sentence is the plot to both Suicide Squad movies, and the plot to a real-world Cold War mission conducted by South Korea. On April 1st, 1968, 31 civilians received the worst April Fool's joke of their life. As the Korean Central Intelligence recruited them for a mission, the group consisted of mainly unemployed youths and petty criminals for a secret mission to assassinate Kim Il-sung. This was done in response to North Korea's own botched attempt at killing the president of South Korea, Park Chung-hee, and this was their response. These 31 individuals were shipped to Shamhado, a small uninhabited island, where they underwent rigorous training. During the training, 7 members were killed, but the training continued. But this mission would not go through, as relationships between the two Koreas were improving. However, you now have 24 angry people on an island who have been tortured and trained to kill, and they were ready to leave. So on August 23rd, 1971, a mutiny began. Every guard on the island, save for 6, were killed as Unit 684 hijacked a boat headed for the South Korean mainland. They made it to their country and got on a bus headed for Seoul. But the bus was soon stopped, and a shootout between the prisoners and the police began, ending in the death of 23. The 4 remaining survivors would all be sentenced to death, and they were executed on March 10th, 1972. In 1947, something streaked through the sky before crashing into the deserts of Roswell, New Mexico, and so began the alien conspiracy theories. Officially, this thing had been labeled as a weather balloon, but of course, people believe it was an alien aircraft. But you knew all that. But did you know there's also a conspiracy that whatever crashed at Roswell was a Soviet device? Or at least, one person believes this, Annie Jacobson. She claims in her book, Area 51, that she spoke with an engineer from Area 51 about the Roswell crash, and how it really was a Soviet device. And now we're back to wonder weapons once again, as the engineer claims that the Soviets repurposed devices made in this time for their Cold War arms race. That's the extent of the story, all anonymous sources and claims with no evidence. Georgy Bolkakov was a key player in the relationship between the Soviet Union and United States, as he was dispatched to Washington, D.C. during the early 60s. Officially, he was there for diplomatic reasons, helping ease tensions between the two superpowers. However, Bolkakov began to meet with both John and Robert Kennedy and began to reveal Soviet secrets to the pair. Secrets of the Berlin Wall, plans before the Vienna summit, and much more was fed primarily to Robert Kennedy, who passed it along to his brother. This is the extent of what we know, but it's believed there's more hidden, waiting to be declassified. On August 17, 1945, George Orwell released one of the most iconic pieces of fiction ever, Animal Farm. Animal Farm is an anti-totalitarian book. It's about farm animals that raise up and take over the farm, and their new leaders turn out to be much worse than the last. It's a direct criticism of communism, and henceforth was banned in the USSR. However, the United States wanted the message of anti-communism to be spread far and wide, so a project to get the books into the USSR began. At the time, the CIA was being led by Edward Hunt, and he began the plan that would later be renamed Audinosaur. The plan was to send hot air balloons from West Germany into the USSR, filled with the books, to be dropped to the citizens below, spreading the message of anti-communism into the USSR. Catching spies was a priority in the Cold War, so any little slip-up was exploited to the fullest, and spies had to play the part down to a T, or down to a staple, because the wrong staples once gave away American spies. Americans entering into the Soviet Union entered with papers and passports and whatever else they needed. Everything was great, except for the staples. That's the problem. The staples were too great, meaning they were made of non-corrosive American stainless steel. A luxury at the time for the Soviet Union, as they were using cheaper metal for non-necessities, including staples. It wasn't just communists that Western nations were scared of getting into their governments, they were also scared of homosexuals. There was another widespread investigation into the backgrounds of employees, with the Red Scare looking for communism and the Lavender Scare looking for homosexuals. This was mostly in the United States government, but other world powers had their own witch hunts underway, and the nation of Canada had developed the fruit machine, a way to find homosexuals. Now, as funny as it is to picture a big ray gun being pointed at someone and it determines if they're gay or not, that's not what it was. The fruit machine was a set of psychological tests to identify gay men. The machine was basically a chair, placed in front of a camera, and when people were being tested for fruitiness, they would be shown erotic pictures of men. And if the participants' pupils dilated, they of course, hey, they're a homosexual. Or they're just being shown a bright light. Of course, this machine was insanely inaccurate, and this program would not last for long. In 2018, a documentary called The Fruit Machine interviews several people who went through the test and how their lives were affected by it. Expanding communication channels was one aspect of the Cold War arms race that is significantly overlooked. Communication started off simple, through corded relays, but the United States wanted a more hidden, reliable, and private way to pass along messages. They wanted their own ionosphere. So I know we're all history nerds here, but we're going to do a quick science lesson. The ionosphere is part of the Earth's atmosphere, and it's called the ionosphere because of the solar irradiation ionizing the area, and it affects basically everything satellite-based we use, including GPS, the radio, and communication relays. And yes, the United States tried to make their own ionosphere during the Cold War, through the efforts of Operation Westford. The idea was to launch a billion, yes, a billion, tiny copper wire pieces into the atmosphere, each one 1.8 centimeters in length. The first batch was launched on October 21st, 1961, but they never deployed from their launch vessel, and their fate remains unknown. 2 years later, a second batch did launch and deploy, and it was a success. Communication between the East and West Coast were boosted. Some needles crashed back down to Earth, but many remain in space, floating around the planet. In the late 1970s, citizens of Vietnam began to report a strange yellow liquid that fell from the skies, and after a few days of contact, plants hit with this liquid would die. Human contact was a bit more concerning, because those affected reported blindness, seizures, and other traumatic injuries. Even though the Cold War was done by this point, the United States was pointing fingers at the Soviet Union, considering the people affected by this yellow rain were loyal to the States. The Soviet Union claimed this to be a lie, but an investigation was launched anyways, where it was found to be pollen. The United States knew it was pollen, but they thought the Soviets were mixing a poison in with the pollen and then deploying it. This again was investigated, and it was found that this pollen was from bees native to Vietnam, meaning if Russia did make this poison, they had to import a ton of bees, something that would have not gone unnoticed. After further investigations, it was determined that this poison was from a fungus, nothing man-made. Right now. Beginning in 1948, the United States Army Chemical Corps began experimentations on human subjects for the development of new chemical weapons. Around 250 chemicals in total were tested on people between 1948 and 75, including nerve agents, mustard agents, and psychoactive drugs such as LSD. This began with the psychoactive drugs immediately after World War II, where they were used in interrogations of captured German soldiers. But then the actual Edgewood Arsenal test began in 1948, as we stated, and ended in 1975, following multiple civil lawsuits. In 1973, NASA sent 2 spiders into space to see if they were able to spin webs. They were 2 female European garden spiders named Arabelle and Anita. At first, the spiders were having trouble due to their zero-gravity conditions, but were eventually able to spin one after adapting. After observing the web, it was found to be a lot finer than one made back on Earth, but that's all we're talking about this because I hate spiders. You can't have one of these things without a female propagandist on the radio. World War II had the Axis Sallies, Vietnam had Hanoi Hannah, and now the Cold/Korean War has Seoul City Sue. Seoul City Sue broadcasted from Pyongyang, North Korea to both South Korean and American forces.
Hi, fellas. How are you today? Not so good, huh? Well, you know what General Sherman said about war. Oh well, it'll only last 7 or 8 years, fellas. Of course it could be less than that, if your leaders would only listen to reason.
Her real name was Anna Suh, being born in Arkansas, but would soon get in a Pepsi mission in Korea, where she married a man named So Kyu Choi. At this time, if an American were to marry a non-American citizen, they would lose their own citizenship, and so she did. When the Cold War broke out, she was able to get some form of vengeance on America with her broadcast, attempting to get American soldiers to surrender. There is no dramatic ending to this. She wasn't killed, arrested, captured, whatever. She just quit by the time the Korean War ended. News. The buzzword of our modern political society. It's a common belief that news agencies are distorting truth for their own narrative, and this is not a new idea. The claim of distorted news has been a concept basically since America's conception, and Deborah Davis believes it was taking place during the Cold War. Davis is an author who alleges that the CIA was paying off, threatening, and otherwise gaining control over journalists to spread the narrative they wanted to spread. There is precedent for this, as a hearing, now called the Church Committee, claimed 50 journalists had these special relations with the CIA. This is the basis of Davis's book, as she believes this didn't stop through the entire Cold War, and the CIA was manipulating media through a joint operation known as Mockingbird. Now, one thing that has been declassified is a Project Mockingbird, where it was revealed that the CIA wiretapped 2 journalists who had written about a piece of classified material, and once again, this fed Deborah's idea of a widespread Operation Mockingbird. On the morning of November 29, 1970, a father and his 2 daughters were hiking through Isdalen, an ice valley located near Bergen, Norway, where they encountered a gruesome sight, a charred corpse. The police were informed, and an investigation was launched. Near the body, several artifacts were found, including a bottle of liquor, plastic water bottles, a thing to hold a passport but no passport, and women's clothing, along with jewelry and burnt paper scraps. Not a lot to go on with. A few days after this, abandoned suitcases were found at the Bergen railway station, which were determined to belong to this lady. The autopsy revealed she was killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. Her last steps were traced back to a hotel, where she was seen and described to be skittish and on edge. One last piece of evidence. Notepads found near her body were transcribed and found she had been to Norway and Paris. So what the hell happened here? The leading theory is that she was a spy, considering so much of her identity was hidden, and this fit in with the time period. Also, several fake names were found across notepads, but it was never determined what her real name was. As forensic technology improved, the Isdal woman's case was reopened, but there were no more answers to be found. Today, it remains one of the most mysterious cold cases in all of Norway. President Theodore Roosevelt once described the United States foreign policy in a single sentence: speak lightly and carry a big stick. And 74 years after saying this, the big stick was built. The USS Theodore Roosevelt is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier built in the 1980s. It's about 1,100 feet in length and is powered by 2 nuclear reactors and carries 90 aircraft. The Big Stick was the first aircraft carrier constructed in the modern way, and it took 3 years to be fully built. But with these modern ways, an estimated 16 months of construction time was taken off. The Big Stick saw its first major action with Desert Shield, and it has been deployed 15 times in total and is still in active service to this day. At the DMZ linking North and South Korea, a 98-foot-tall poplar tree was blocking the line of sight between 2 United Nations checkpoints, and the tree was on the North Korean side. So on August 18, 1976, 5 South Korean personnel escorted by a group of United Nations soldiers crossed into the DMZ to trim the tree. After about 15 minutes of pruning, 15 North Korean soldiers appeared and began to watch the act. 20 other soldiers joined and were armed with crowbars and clubs, threatening the tree pruners to leave, to which they didn't. So, they attacked and killed a few American soldiers. In a show of force, the United Nations launched Operation Paul Bunyan. This consisted of 23 vehicles with 617 personnel in total crossing into the DMZ to cut down the tree. North Korea sent about 200 soldiers in response, but no shots were fired. The North Koreans watched them chop down the tree and cross back into the South Korean side of the DMZ. It was feared this was going to lead to a much bigger problem, but it did not. The American officials were worried that a war with the Soviet Union would entail the capturing of Alaska, considering they were separated by mere miles. So plans for an occupied Alaska entered fruition, and it became known as Operation Washtub, also called the STAGE, Stay Behind Agent Program. This entailed the construction of an intelligence network to have all eyes on the frozen state. Keeping stay-behind agents housed and safe was also a part of this plan, as well as escape routes into Canada should they be needed. The plan was founded by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, and it was him who put a stop to it, as in September of 1951, for unknown reasons, all FBI agents were pulled from the state. On December 1st, 1948, a body of a man was found near Somerton Park, located in South Australia. He was found laying in the sand, a half-smoked cigarette near his body. Several artifacts were found on his body as well, but none to identify the man with. Witnesses came forward claiming he had been laying on that beach for several hours, and he was moving. So he was passed off as a drunk, not an uncommon sight on an Australian beach. During his autopsy, the strangest thing about it was the spleen, and it was 3 times the normal size. His cause of death was determined to be acute gastritis, but his identity was still not known, so the investigation continued. On January 14th, about 6 weeks after the body was found, a suitcase with a label removed was found, and it's believed to have belonged to this man. Most marks of identity were removed, but the name T. Kane was found. So investigations into a missing man named T. Kane were launched, which resulted in nothing being found. Now, I know this might be lazy, but there is a massive investigation into who the Somerton man was, big enough to warrant its own video or videos, which has been done. I'll spoil the ending though right now. The results are inconclusive, and the identity of this guy is still not known. Thanksgiving, 1948. Frank Olson is in his hotel room when he decides he's had enough. So he throws himself from the window, hitting the sidewalk below. He tried to mutter something to the onlookers, but he was in no shape to talk. Frank was dead. He had taken his own life. Or did he? Let's back up. Frank Olson served as a captain in the United States Army Chemical Corps, where in December of 1942, he was contacted by Ira Baldwin with the task. He would head the CIA's new program, the MK Ultra Project. Here, he put his skills as a chemist to use, developing several biological weapons. Soon, we will talk about Operation Sea Spray, and Frank was a part of this. But he didn't like his position, so he soon stepped down. He tried to leave all government work, an idea that really cemented after he was drugged, becoming a victim of the MK Ultra program himself. So he decided enough was enough. He decided to step down fully and undergo psychiatric treatment. He flew to New York City with Robert Lashbrook, a co-worker, and now we're on Thanksgiving in 1948 and he had just hit the sidewalk. When the police went up to his room, they found Robert up there, sitting on the toilet, acting if nothing happened. From here, the conspiracy theory surrounding his death took place, and it's believed he did not take his own life. It's believed he was pushed or thrown from the window, and his family believes this as well. The story of Frank Olson remains very much alive today, with a documentary on Netflix taking a deeper dive and look into this story, and his living relatives continue to search for answers. Alright, my friends, I think this may be our last close call of the Cold War. We've covered so many. The times when the United States and Soviets were ready to fire at each other on the drop of a dime, and this is our last story. But it's not going to sound unfamiliar to you at all. In the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet B-59 nuclear submarine was on the ocean floor near Cuba. They had lost contact with Moscow days before, and were picking up on American civilian radio networks. So they guessed they were close. Their guess was correct, as a group of 11 American Navy-owned ships were attempting to force the submarine to surface. This was in international waters, so the states had no jurisdiction. But here they were, dropping signal charges. So the people in the submarine believed they were at war and were ready to fire back. On board was Vasily Arkhipov, and we can thank him for not firing back, as he convinced everyone on board not to fire, after a lengthy argument where he was the only one against the firing. But no weapons were launched. So they surfaced and spoke with both the United States Navy and the Soviet Union, who ordered them back home. That's it, all of the close calls out of the way. But we have a couple more Cold War stories to round out our iceberg. Let's finish this thing. It's a common joke that the United States gets involved with a lot of Central and South American governments, and it's really not a joke. They did that. And a big joint plan became known as Operation Condor. Across South America, 8 dictatorships who were backed by the United States began to make plans to put themselves into power across the continent. This entailed the murder of left-wing sympathizers, kidnappings, coups, and whatever else was needed to gain power over their land. This was an awful time in South American history, as upwards of 50,000 people were killed, 300,000 are still considered missing, and over 400,000 people were arrested in this time frame, all of which was being backed by the United States government. Oleg Penkovsky served with the Soviet Union during World War II, but with the turn of the conflict, too brought a turn in allegiance for him. As he offered to spy on his country for the United States and United Kingdom, Oleg was brought in by MI6 for an interrogation, where he was given permission to spy. For 18 months, he supplied information on anything the Soviets were hiding, including the true extent of their nuclear stockpile and the production capabilities behind such. However, Oleg wouldn't stay hidden for long, as he was arrested and killed in November of 1962. If the Cold War could be summarized with 2 events, it would be the arms race and the space race, and Project A119 was a blending of the two, as Project A119 was the United States' plan to detonate a nuke on the moon, all just to stick it to the Soviet Union. The project first entered discussion in 1949, 8 years before the launch of Sputnik, and 20 years before the moon landing occurred. The plan didn't last for long, as the fear of the device crashing back to Earth triumphed understanding for what would happen should it go off on the surface of the moon. In September of 1959, Nikita Khrushchev was set to spend nearly 2 weeks in the United States, and he traveled the entire country in the span. He began his vacation in Washington, D.C., before traveling to the New York City and later to the Midwest. But the focus of this entry is his time in California. He began a tour of the state by visiting the Fox Studios before attending a lunch hosted by Frank Sinatra, with famous guests Marilyn Monroe and Gary Cooper. Once lunch was over, Khrushchev expressed desire to visit Disneyland, but he was denied access to the site. This was because the American government could not guarantee his safety, to which Khrushchev said, "What, is there a roaming band of teenagers? Is there a cholera outbreak, or are you hiding missile launch sites?" And he threatened to end his life right there. Man really wanted to ride Space Mountain, but he was not allowed to visit and was grumpy about it for the rest of his trip. On October 11th, 1950, 11 residents of San Francisco checked into a hospital with a very serious urinary tract infection. 10 of these citizens were treated, but 1 passed away. It was found these 11 had been to a hospital very recently, so it was believed there was a contaminant there. And they were right. save for the location. As it wasn't a contaminant at the hospital, it was in the entire city. Beginning in September of 1950, the United States Navy had released 2 types of bacteria from a ship off the coast of San Francisco. This was to test the feasibility of a foreign biological warfare attack. Enough bacteria was released to infect all 800,000 residents with the virus, but like we said, only 11 came forward with the strange sickness. Well, here we are again, the end of another iceberg, and you know I've always got to save the most obscure, weirdest story for last. And our last story for today involves a nuclear test conducted in space. The United States had very little idea of how radiation in space worked, so they undertook Operation Fishbowl, a set of nuclear detonations to be conducted in outer space, and Starfish Prime was the largest test. On July 9th, 1962, just 5 days after the 4th of July, Americans and the rest of the world were about to get a real fireworks show. It's on this day when the United States sent up a 1.4 megaton nuclear warhead, detonating it 250 miles above the Earth. This was launched from Hawaii, but the entire planet saw it. Large, widespread auroras lit up the sky in a bright red, but the rest of the world was affected by it, but they did not receive a light show. Several satellites were disabled, and the entire electrical grid was knocked out of Hawaii. Thanks to Starfish Prime, we were given an insight into how an EMP attack would work, and how we could mitigate its effects, should we ever need to worry about one. And here we are, another installment of Mysteries and Obscurities completed. If you're interested, I've done similar videos for World War I and II and the Vietnam War, and what's next? That's right, the Civil War. I've got the entry list made and I'm hard at work with it, so stay tuned for that. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first one to know about my new videos. I also have a Twitter and Discord server linked in my bio if you're interested, but I'm done yapping. I've got more things to edit. Thanks again for watching, and as always, have a wonderful day.